There is a walk that happens every night in Cairo that tourists never see. Long after the crowds have left and the museum lights dim to emergency amber, a curator moves through corridors that don't appear on any floor plan. 3 locked doors stand between the public galleries and what lies beneath. The first requires a standard key, the second, a biometric scan. The third opens only with approval from the director himself, and even then, only for inventory, never for study. Behind those doors, the temperature holds steady at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. The humidity never wavers. In this manufactured climate, objects rest on steel shelves that extend into darkness beyond what any flashlight can reach. These are not the golden masks and painted sarcophagi that fill the halls above. These artifacts tell different stories, ones deemed too complicated for the narrative that brings millions through the museum's front doors each year. On one shelf, a collection of bronze knives curves in unnatural shapes, edges still dark with stains that modern analysis confirms as human blood. Not the blood of sacrifice victims, the reports specify, but of the priests themselves. The papyri stored beside them describe ceremonies that journals refuse to publish, rituals where the line between medicine and something else entirely blurs beyond recognition. The academic committees who first translated these texts in the 1950s made a choice. Some knowledge, they decided, serves no educational purpose. Further back, wrapped in cloth that predates the pyramids, stand statues of deities whose names were deliberately erased from temple walls in antiquity, not by foreign conquerors or Christian zealots, but by the Egyptians themselves. These gods represented something so unsettling to the ancient civilization that they chose cultural amnesia over acknowledgement. Even the hieroglyphs that might have named them were chiseled away with systematic precision, leaving only smooth stone where once there were prayers. The curator remembers when these arrived from a dig site near Abydos. The lead archaeologist had looked unwell, thinner than in photographs from just months before. He'd insisted on delivering them personally, refusing to let them travel through normal channels. In the shipping documentation, he'd written only a single line of description followed by a request that they never be displayed. His request was honoured, though not for the reasons he gave. The review board agreed for reasons they never fully articulated in official minutes. This happens more often than the public knows. Discoveries are made, decisions are reached in closed meetings, and certain chapters of history are quietly filed away. The Egypt presented in documentaries and textbooks is a carefully curated version, sanded down until it fits comfortably into lesson plans and family museum visits. It is an Egypt of noble pharaohs and mysterious, but ultimately benign religious practices. But in these locked rooms another Egypt waits, one that suggests the ancients understood things we've chosen to forget. The question isn't whether these artifacts exist. They do, documented and catalogued, sitting in darkness beneath the world's most visited Egyptian museum. The question is what they reveal about the people who made them, and why that truth remains too uncomfortable for display. The history of Egyptology begins with a secret that nobody talks about. When Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the hieroglyphic code in 1822, he opened a door that couldn't be closed. But the scholars who followed him through that door made a collective decision, one that shaped every textbook written since. Some passages, they agreed, would be translated differently than what the symbols actually said. Other passages would simply be noted as damaged or unclear, even when the stone was perfectly preserved. There is a letter, archived in the British Museum's restricted collections, written by a translator named William Blackwood in 1897. He'd been working on tomb inscriptions from the Valley of the Kings when he encountered text that stopped him completely. The hieroglyphs described the pharaoh's journey through the Duat, the realm beyond death, but these weren't the poetic metaphors published in academic journals. These were instructions, specific technical directions for navigating a landscape of entities, the text called the Devourers. The translator wrote to his colleague that publishing his accurate translation would end his career. His colleague agreed. The published version spoke vaguely of spiritual trials. The original photographs, still held in museum archives, tell a different story entirely. This pattern repeats across decades of early translation work. Symbols that clearly depicted ritual acts involving human bodies were reinterpreted as symbolic representations. One particular hieroglyph, which appears in texts discussing certain midnight ceremonies, was officially translated as referring to the consumption of sacred bread. Yet the symbol itself is unmistakably anatomical, showing specific human organs with precise detail. When independent researchers in the 1970s attempted to correct this translation, their papers were rejected by every major journal. The reasoning given was always academic, but the effect was censorship. The Book of the Dead offers the clearest example of this sanitization. The version sold in museum gift shops presents a comforting vision of the afterlife, where good hearts are rewarded and bad ones are punished. But earlier papyri, ones not chosen for publication, describe the weighing of the heart differently. They detail what happens to those found wanting in language so explicit that Victorian scholars literally burned several copies rather than translate them. The souls weren't simply destroyed or sent to oblivion. Something consumed them, something the texts describe with an attention to detail that suggests eyewitness accounts rather than theological speculation. Sexual magic presents another realm of deliberate mistranslation. Temple texts from Karnak contain hieroglyphic sequences describing rituals that 19th century scholars found impossible to reconcile with their image of ancient Egypt as a noble civilization. These passages were consistently translated using euphemisms, so vague they became meaningless. The phrase that appears most frequently in these censored sections literally translates to a description of physical union between priests and entities the texts call visitors from the starred sky. Published translations render this as prayers to celestial deities, losing entirely the physicality the original language emphasizes. What emerges from comparing original hieroglyphic photographs to published translations is a pattern of systematic revision. Academic Egyptology constructed an ancient Egypt that modern audiences could admire, a civilization of architectural genius and poetic spirituality. But the hieroglyphs themselves, when read without Victorian sensibilities intervening, describe something stranger and darker. They speak of a culture that believed the supernatural wasn't metaphorical but physical, that maintained practices bridging worlds in ways we've chosen to reframe as primitive superstition. The texts were censored because they insisted on being literal when scholars needed them to be symbolic. And if the written records were this carefully sanitized, what truths might the physical remains reveal? The museum displays show golden masks catching spotlight, linen wrappings arranged in perfect geometric patterns, painted coffins promising eternal paradise. What they don't show are the CT scan images, the ones kept in research databases that require institutional access. Those images tell a different story about the journey to immortality. In 2006, a team from Cairo University performed advanced imaging on a collection of mummies recovered from a nobleman's tomb near Luxor. The scans were routine, part of an ongoing project to catalogue bone structure and preservation methods. What they found in the third sarcophagus wasn't routine at all. The body inside showed compression fractures in the ribcage consistent with movement during the wrapping process. The linen wasn't just tight, it had been pulled against resisting muscle, fabric embedding into skin while the tissue was still pliable, still living. The position of the hands told the rest. They weren't folded peacefully across the chest, as the outer wrapping suggested. Beneath multiple layers, the fingers clawed upward, frozen mid-grasp. This wasn't an isolated discovery. Forensic analysis of mummies has quietly accumulated evidence that challenges the peaceful image of ancient Egyptian burial. Chemical analysis of tissue samples reveals compounds consistent with paralytic agents, substances that would have stopped movement without stopping consciousness. The ancient Egyptians were master pharmacologists. They knew plants that could render a person unable to move while leaving them fully aware. Papyri describing embalming procedures mention these preparations, though always in a bleak language that earlier translators chose to interpret as preservatives rather than poisons. The subsidiary burials present even darker evidence. These are the servants, guards, and attendants buried in smaller chambers surrounding the main tomb, meant to serve their master in the afterlife. School lessons present these as honored positions, loyal servants, choosing to follow their pharaoh beyond death. The physical evidence suggests something less voluntary. Young men and women, teenagers mostly, their skeletons showing specific trauma patterns. Hyoid bones fractured in ways consistent with strangulation. Others display evidence of suffocation, linen fragments found deep in throat passages, pushed past the point where any voluntary action could have placed them. One tomb discovered in 1983 contained 12 subsidiary burials arranged in a circle around the central sarcophagus. All 12 were women between ages 15 and 20. All 12 showed identical breaks in cervical vertebrae. precise enough to suggest systematic execution by someone who knew exactly where to strike. The tomb had been sealed from the outside. There was no way for them to have entered, laid down in their prepared positions, and somehow sealed themselves in. Yet the archaeological reports filed with the Egyptian Antiquities Authority described these as ritual burials, conducted with respect and ceremony, making no mention of the trauma evident in every skeleton. The child mummies force the most uncomfortable questions. Small sarcophagi, decorated with protective symbols and prayers for safe passage. Inside, bodies no more than 5 or 6 years old, positioned in ways that speak of final panic. One case from the Saqqara necropolis shows a child whose hands are wrapped at shoulder height, not in the standard crossed position. The imaging reveals why. The small fingers are clenched into fists, so tight that several bones fractured under the pressure. This is the hand position of someone in extreme distress. Muscles contracting with force that only terror produces. The wrappings went on while those muscles were still contracting, preserving the moment forever. Modern Egyptologists explain these findings carefully. They speak of complex burial rituals we don't fully understand, of cultural practices that made sense within their own context. They suggest that what appears as suffering might have been considered sacred, that our modern lens distorts ancient intentions, but the bones don't interpret, they simply record. And what they record is pain, fear, and awareness during processes we've been taught were performed only on the peacefully deceased. The beautiful death masks were hammered from gold, while below them, in darkness, bodies struggled against wrappings that grew tighter with each layer. The painted scenes of paradise on sarcophagus, lids concealed final moments of anything but peace. The preservation was perfect, detailed enough that modern technology can read the evidence 3,000 years later. Every muscle contraction, every desperate movement, every instance of trauma carefully mummified and sealed away. The ancient Egyptians believed that preserving the body preserved the soul, that immortality required the physical form to remain intact through eternity. They achieved preservation so complete that we can now see exactly what they preserved, not just bodies, but the manner of their deaths, the truth beneath the ceremony. The promise of eternal life came with costs measured in suffering, paid by those who had no choice in the transactions. These weren't accidents or unfortunate side effects of a complex process. The evidence is too systematic, too consistent, across different time periods and different sites. This was understood. This was in some way we've sanitized from historical record, considered necessary. The question becomes, who made these decisions? Who determined that the path to immortality required this specific horror? And if these practices were so carefully orchestrated, what organization maintained them across the dynasties? Beneath the Temple of Set at Avaris, excavators found something in 1998 that didn't fit any known pattern of Egyptian worship. A passage, deliberately filled with rubble sometime in the 12th dynasty, led downward at an angle too steep for ceremonial procession. At its end, a chamber with walls of perfectly fitted basalt blocks, material that had to be transported from quarries over 800 kilometers away. The effort required suggests importance. What happened in that chamber suggests why it was eventually sealed. The altar stands in the center, 4 meters square, cut from a single piece of black granite. Its surface shows grooves worn smooth by repeated use, channels that lead to collection basins carved into the floor. Chemical analysis of residue embedded in the stone's microscopic pores revealed proteins consistent with human hemoglobin, dated through carbon isotope decay to the period when the temple above was actively used. The concentration is too high for accidental contamination. This altar processed blood in quantities that could only come from ritual purpose. The walls bear inscriptions that don't appear in any published hieroglyphic dictionary. When linguists finally attempted translation, working from high-resolution photographs, the excavation team wasn't supposed to release. They found references to the Mesu Batesh. The name translates literally as children of chaos or offspring of rebellion, depending on how you interpret the determinative symbols. These were priests who operated within the larger temple structure, but answered to different authorities, or perhaps to no human authority at all. Official Egyptian records from the Second Intermediate Period contain suspicious gaps. King lists that should continue unbroken suddenly skip decades. Temple construction records reference chambers that don't appear in architectural surveys. Papyri that mention certain ritual cycles are consistently damaged in the same sections, as if someone systematically destroyed specific information while leaving surrounding text intact. This pattern of selective erasure appears across multiple sites and time periods, suggesting organized effort rather than random degradation. The artifacts recovered from Avaris and similar hidden chambers tell of practices that mainstream Egyptology struggles to contextualize. Implements of bronze and meteoric iron, shaped for purposes that become clear only when compared to ritual descriptions in the partially destroyed papyri. Masks made from human skulls, overlaid with electrum, positioned in ways that suggest they were worn during ceremonies rather than displayed. Small tablets of fired clay-bearing seals that match nothing in the standard catalogue of Egyptian official marks. These belong to an organization that maintained its own symbols of authority. Most disturbing are the references to what these priests claim to contact. The fragments that survive speak of the crawling chaos and the Black Pharaoh, entities described not as gods in the traditional sense, but as visitors or presences that existed outside normal cosmic order. The texts suggest these beings offered knowledge in exchange for specific acts, ceremonies that required what the papyri call the Red Sacrament and the Breathing Offering. The language is careful, almost coded, written by people who knew their words might be found by unsympathetic eyes. Contemporary accounts from Orthodox priesthoods reveal fear. Temple records from Karnak mention cleansings performed after certain groups were discovered operating within the larger temple complex. The pharaoh Ahmose issued an edict, now fragmentary, that references those who speak with the shapeless ones and mandates their exile to the desert margins. Yet archaeological evidence shows these groups persisted for centuries after that edict, suggesting they held power that made them difficult to fully eliminate. Academic Egyptology labels these findings as evidence of fringe cults, aberrant practices that existed on the margins of respectable society. This explanation ignores the sophistication of the hidden chambers, the quality of the artifacts, and the clear evidence that these groups had access to resources and knowledge that rivaled official priesthoods. The Temple of Set Chamber required engineering expertise and material wealth that only state-level organization could provide. These weren't desperate cultists hiding in caves. These were initiated priests operating parallel hierarchies within the very heart of Egyptian religious infrastructure. The thoroughness of the historical erasure tells its own story. When you systematically destroy records across multiple sites over extended time periods, when you fill ritual chambers with rubble and rewrite king lists to remove decades, you're not dismissing irrelevant fringe groups. You're fighting an enemy powerful enough to threaten the official narrative, dangerous enough that even their memory needs to be eliminated. The Mesu Batesh were erased because they were effective at something, because whatever they practiced produced results that orthodox authorities couldn't permit or couldn't control. The question becomes, what exactly were these rituals meant to accomplish? What did these priests believe they were contacting in those sealed chambers? And most unsettling, if the ceremonies actually achieved their purpose, what did they bring into the world? The Temple of Dendera contains a ceiling map that shouldn't exist. The zodiac carved into stone above the main chamber shows constellations visible only from latitudes south of the equator. Stars the ancient Egyptians, bound to the northern hemisphere, should never have observed. When astronomers first analyzed the positioning in 1891, they assumed errors in the carving. Computer modeling proved otherwise. The accuracy is exact, showing southern skies as they appeared in the predynastic period. Someone mapped stars from a vantage point they couldn't physically occupy. Hidden chambers beneath the same temple reveal how such knowledge might have been obtained. Inscriptions describe ceremonies conducted during specific stellar alignments, rituals the priests claimed allowed them to see through the eyes of entities positioned beyond earthly perspective. The price for this borrowed vision is listed with mathematical precision, calculations showing ratios between human blood volume and the duration of enhanced perception. 47.3 milliliters for every hour of sight, the numbers specify. The priests kept detailed accounting. Mathematics presents even stranger anomalies. A papyrus fragment recovered from the sealed chamber at Avaris contains calculations using pi accurate to 15 decimal places. This document dates to the 17th century BCE, over 3,000 years before such precision was achieved through conventional mathematical development. More unsettling is the notation system used. a base 13 mathematics that appears nowhere else in Egyptian records. The fragment references this system as the counting of the crawling dark, suggesting it was taught rather than developed, knowledge received from external source. Multiple ritual sites, when mapped from above, create geometric patterns with specific mathematical properties. The arrangement of altars at 5 interconnected sites in the Fayum oasis forms a pentagram precise enough that modern surveyors express amazement at the engineering required. But the geometry goes deeper. The channels carved into each altar's surface, when filled with liquid and viewed from specific angles during equinox sunlight, create interference patterns mathematically identical to those produced by quantum wave functions. This comparison means nothing until you realize the channels were carved 3 millennia before quantum physics existed as a concept. The priests who designed these systems left explanations written in their private hieroglyphs. They described the geometric arrangements as doorways or thresholds, claiming certain patterns in specific orientations, created thin places where the boundary between here and elsewhere grew permeable. The calculations carved into altar stones read like equations attempting to quantify this permeability. They reference variables we recognize: distance, time, mass combined with symbols we don't, values assigned to concepts like shadow depth and star pressure. These equations accompany diagrams showing figures passing through rendered portals, hieroglyphic captions describing beings that could traverse such openings when properly summoned. Several high-ranking priests simply vanish from historical records after participating in major ritual cycles. One example, Samtik Seneb, chief priest of the Mesu, Petesh during the 13th dynasty, mentioned in 17 separate documents over a 12-year period, then nothing. His name was chiseled from his tomb before the burial chamber was sealed, his personal effects distributed as if he died, but no body was ever interred. The final papyrus bearing his name is a warning written to his successor, damaged but partially legible. The mathematics are correct, the gates open as calculated, but what emerges is not what enters, and the price of seeing truly is seeing always. The official explanation is that these priests were stripped of rank for heretical practices. The evidence suggests something more unsettling, that their calculations worked, their geometric doorways opened as designed, and whatever knowledge or transformation they gained removed them from recordable history entirely. They achieved the transcendence they sought. But transcendence proved to be something other than ascension. The crown of Egypt carried obligations that went beyond governing the living. When a new pharaoh ascended the throne, certain ceremonies occurred away from public view, in chambers beneath the royal palace that weren't marked on any architectural plan. These weren't coronation rituals. These were negotiations, contracts being renewed with parties whose existence predated the first dynasty by unknown centuries. Akhenaten understood this better than most. His sudden revolution, abandoning the traditional gods for worship of the Aten, reads differently when you examine what he was really trying to escape. In the ruins of his abandoned capital at Amarna, excavators found a chamber sealed with unusual thoroughness. Inside, an altar had been deliberately destroyed, smashed with such force that fragments embedded in the walls. The hieroglyphs on those fragments don't praise the sun disk. They're a declaration of independence, a formal severing of agreements the text calls the ancient bindings. Akhenaten wasn't just changing Egypt's religion, he was attempting to break contracts his ancestors had made, bargains that demanded periodic payment. The traditional explanation for Akhenaten's fate, that he died of natural causes or was overthrown, ignores what happened to his bloodline. His sons died in sequence, each within months of assuming power. His daughters disappeared from records. The 18th dynasty, which had ruled for 2 centuries, collapsed completely within a generation of his revolution. Historical coincidence, scholars say, but the pattern appears elsewhere whenever pharaohs attempted to renegotiate or refuse the old arrangements. Beneath palace foundations at Thebes, Memphis, and other royal seats, identical chambers exist. Square rooms, always below ground level, with altars positioned at precise distances from the walls. The altars show familiar evidence. Chemical analysis confirms human blood, quantities measured in liters rather than drops. But the drainage systems reveal the true purpose. Channels lead from the altars to sealed repositories, stone vessels designed to accumulate offerings without ever being emptied. At Memphis, archaeologists opened one such vessel in 2004. It contained organic material preserved in natron salt, compressed layers representing centuries of deposits. The composition defied standard analysis. Human tissue, yes, but arranged in patterns suggesting deliberate assembly rather than random accumulation. The royal mummies themselves carry evidence of transformation. CT scans of New Kingdom pharaohs reveal bone density variations that shouldn't occur naturally. Tissue showing cellular changes that resemble mutation more than degradation. Tutankhamun's mummy exhibits anomalies mainstream science, attributes to genetic disorders from royal inbreeding. But the specific nature of those anomalies, extra bone growth in geometrically precise locations, organ tissue displaying unknown cellular structures, suggests alteration rather than deformity. These weren't birth defects. These were modifications occurring during the pharaoh's lifetime, physical changes that came with wearing the crown. Records from the 19th dynasty describe disasters following ritual failures with suspicious specificity. When Seti I delayed a required ceremony during a particular lunar eclipse, a plague swept through Thebes within 3 weeks, killing thousands. When Rameses III attempted to modify the traditional rites, reducing the offerings specified in ancient protocols, the Sea Peoples invaded within that same year, nearly destroying Egypt entirely. Orthodox historians view these as unrelated events, political and epidemiological coincidences. The timing suggests otherwise. The contracts had terms, and violations brought immediate consequences. The practice of substitute kings offers the darkest evidence of these arrangements. During dangerous celestial alignments, specific conjunctions that occurred every 7 or 19 years, a commoner would be crowned pharaoh for a single day, given the crown, the regalia, the full authority of kingship. Then, at sunset, this temporary ruler would be taken to the underground chambers. The legitimate pharaoh would resume power the following morning. Official records call these substitute kings a symbolic tradition, a ritual humility where the pharaoh acknowledged mortality. Archaeological evidence from the execution sites tells a different story. The substitute absorbed something meant for the true pharaoh, took on obligations or debts that accumulated with each cycle of rule. Their sacrifice wasn't symbolic atonement, it was contractual transfer, moving cosmic liabilities from the permanent ruler to a temporary replacement who would pay the price before dawn. The sophistication of this system, the legal and magical frameworks required to make such transfers binding, suggests consultation with parties who understood cosmic law far better than human priests. Egypt's divine kingship wasn't metaphorical. The pharaohs were transformed, altered by forces that granted power in exchange for specific terrible payments. The crown changed whoever wore it, physically and spiritually, binding them to agreements that stretched back to when the first stones of the first pyramids broke ground. Akhenaten tried to break free, and his line ended in chaos. Other pharaohs who resisted faced plagues, invasions, and disasters too precisely timed to dismiss as chance. The question becomes, if the rulers themselves were bound to these dark contracts, what did such forces demand from the common peoples? In 1913, a Belgian expedition working near Saqqara opened a tomb that had been sealed with unusual measures. The entrance wasn't just blocked with stone, it was plastered over, painted to match the surrounding wall, deliberately hidden in ways that suggested someone wanted this particular burial forgotten entirely. Inside, they found no sarcophagus, no mummy, no treasure, just a stone chest wrapped in chains of electrum, sealed with wax that bore the mark of the high priests of Anubis. When the chest was opened at the expedition house that night, it contained 7 scrolls of blackened papyrus, text written in ink that chemical analysis would later identify as a compound of charcoal and human blood. The expedition leader, Franoye Bouvier, made the mistake of attempting translation. His journal entries from the following weeks chart a descent that colleagues initially attributed to heat sickness. He wrote of words that seemed to shift between readings, hieroglyphs that rearranged themselves when he looked away. More concerning were his descriptions of what the scrolls contained. These weren't the spells from the Book of the Dead, prayers meant to guide souls through the afterlife. These were instructions for opening pathways while still living, for calling to the other side, and demanding audience with what dwelled there. Bouvier's final journal entry, written in increasingly erratic script, describes beginning the translation of the third scroll. It contained a ritual titled The Feast of Essential Truth, which required the practitioner to consume the eyes and tongue of a person who had died in terror, while reciting invocations to something the text called the Faceless Feaster. The scroll promised that those who completed this ceremony would see reality as it truly existed, stripped of the comforting illusions that protect human sanity. Bouvier was found 3 days later in his locked study, having torn out his own eyes. The scrolls were never seen again, though expedition records confirm their existence, and Bouvier's photographs of the first 2 scrolls survive in Brussels archives. These weren't isolated texts. Egyptian magical literature divides into 2 categories that academic Egyptology rarely acknowledges. There are the books meant for public consumption, the Book of the Dead and similar collections providing prayers for protection and guidance. Then there are the other books, ones written for practitioners who sought not protection but power, not guidance but domination over forces that existed in spaces between life and death. The Book of Coming Forth by Night stands as the darkest example. Only fragments remain, scattered across museum collections that don't advertise their possession, where the Book of Coming Forth by Day describes the soul's journey through the underworld, as a petitioner seeking judgment. The night version describes that same realm as territory to be conquered. The spells don't request the favor of gods. They command entities, specifically described as dwelling outside the god's dominion. Fragments recovered from a tomb at Abydos contain invocations that translate to demands rather than prayers, words meant to compel rather than beseech. The physical evidence of these texts tells its own story. Papyri found with burn marks around specific passages, damage too precise to be accidental. Someone went through these scrolls methodically destroying certain sections while leaving others intact. Passages scratched out with such force that the papyrus tore hieroglyphs chiseled from stone tablets with systematic thoroughness. The ancient Egyptians who preserved everything, who wrote on every available surface, made deliberate choices to eliminate specific knowledge. They understood that some information carried its own danger, that certain words once read could not be unread. Modern attempts to reconstruct complete versions from fragments have ended poorly. A German archaeologist named Klaus Richter spent 12 years collecting photographs and transcriptions of every surviving fragment of the night version. His colleagues reported increasing paranoia in his final months, claims that something was watching him through the words, that translating the text created a connection the entities on the other side could sense. Richter disappeared in 2007 while working alone in a museum archive in Cairo. His research notes were found scattered across the floor. The final page contained a single sentence in ancient Egyptian, translated by investigators as they answered my calling. There are rumors persistent enough to appear in multiple sources that complete copies exist. Private collectors who allegedly possess intact scrolls of the night version, housed in climate-controlled vaults and never shown even to trusted experts. These collectors understand something academics pretend not to know, that these texts weren't simply historical documents describing ancient beliefs. They were operational manuals, instructions that still function, spells that still work if performed correctly. The knowledge they contain is infectious in the literal sense, ideas that propagate themselves through whoever reads them, changing the reader in ways that can't be reversed. The ancient Egyptians built their civilization on the control of death, on mastering the transition between worlds. But their magical texts reveal a civilization that didn't just theorize about the afterlife. They interacted with it, opened channels to realms they called by many names, but consistently described as hungry. The public spells, the ones copied on tomb walls and sold as papyri to wealthy citizens, were protective measures. The hidden books, the ones they burned and buried and sealed behind warnings, contained the actual techniques for engaging with forces that protection spells were designed to guard against. Libraries burned to destroy single scrolls, tombs sealed and hidden to contain specific texts. Priests who possessed certain knowledge hunted down and executed, their works scattered and destroyed. The ancient Egyptians knew the difference between information and contagion, between knowledge that enlightened and knowledge that corrupted. They made choices about what should survive and what should disappear into the desert sand. But books have a way of surviving, hidden in private collections or sealed in tombs yet to be discovered. The scrolls still exist, somewhere, waiting in darkness for someone curious enough or foolish enough to break the seals. and the entities those scrolls describe how to summon. They're patient in ways human minds can't comprehend, waiting across barriers that grow thinner each time someone reads the forbidden words. The question isn't whether these texts should exist. They do exist, documented and photographed, fragments held in museums across the world. The question is, what happens to those who insist on reading them? Lord Carnarvon's death, 5 months after entering Tutankhamun's tomb, became legend. Mosquito bite, infection, pneumonia, medical explanations that satisfied most people. What doesn't satisfy is the pattern that followed. Not just with that tomb, but with others whose violations resulted in death clusters that defy statistical probability. Between 1923 and 1928, 47 individuals directly involved in excavating or transporting artifacts from 3 specific Egyptian tombs died under circumstances ranging from sudden illness to bizarre accidents. The tombs had nothing in common except one feature. Each contained identical curse tablets, inscribed warnings, threatening specific fates to those who disturbed the dead. The threats weren't vague. They described symptoms: fever that wouldn't break, bleeding from the eyes, madness that drove men to leap from heights. The victims' medical records, preserved in hospital archives across Europe and Egypt, document symptoms matching those ancient descriptions with uncomfortable precision. The curse tablets themselves revealed something darker than mere written threats. Chemical analysis performed in the 1990s on tablets recovered from the tomb of Angkor showed mineral compounds combined in ways that shouldn't occur naturally. Arsenic blended with mercury and organic alkaloids, the mixture aged but chemically stable, designed to release as dust when disturbed. The ancient Egyptians understood toxicology with sophistication that rivals modern chemistry. They created slow-acting poisons that could remain viable across millennia, sealed in tombs waiting for violators who might come centuries or thousands of years later. But poison explains only the physical deaths. It doesn't explain what happened to the minds. The Stele of Xenophon presents the clearest example of curses that operate through pure information rather than chemical agents. This artifact, currently held in a London museum's restricted collection, has been translated by 6 different scholars over the past century. All 6 developed identical psychiatric symptoms. They began with insomnia, progressed to auditory hallucinations of voices speaking ancient Egyptian, and culminated in obsessive behaviors centered around completing what they called the ritual described in the stone. 4 of the 6 attempted self-harm before intervention. The 2 who succeeded left notes, written in hieroglyphs they shouldn't have known, using grammatical constructions that don't appear in any documented Egyptian text. The stele's hieroglyphs contain nothing obviously dangerous. It is a standard funerary inscription, prayers for the deceased's journey through the duat. Yet something in the specific combination of symbols, the sequence of words, creates a psychological effect in those who study it intensively. Neurologists who examined the affected translators found unusual activity patterns in brain scans, activation clusters in regions associated with religious experience and fear response, persisting long after exposure to the text ended. Museums quietly maintain lists of artifacts that produce similar effects. These pieces carry internal designations: conservation priority, requires specialist handling, limited access for research purposes. The real reason they're withdrawn from public view appears in internal memos that never enter official publications. Staff members working with certain objects develop patterns of illness, not dramatic curse of the pharaoh theatrical deaths, but statistical clusters of depression, anxiety disorders, and what psychiatrists categorize as obsessive, compulsive behaviors with atypical presentations. The British Museum keeps 17 Egyptian artifacts in storage, specifically because employees handling them reported shared hallucinations. The Louvre has 9 pieces marked for restricted access, after 3 curators working with them independently developed identical nightmares involving flooded chambers and drowning while unable to move. These institutions don't publicize these decisions. They simply remove the objects from display and assign them storage codes that ensure minimal human contact. The ancient Egyptians didn't just write curses, they engineered them, using combinations of chemistry and psychology, poison and belief, creating weapons that could kill across the vast expanse of centuries. Some operated through physical means, toxic compounds waiting in sealed darkness. Others functioned through information itself, hieroglyphic combinations that infected minds the way viruses infect bodies, reprogramming thought patterns until the victim became an agent of their own destruction. The question that haunts every museum with Egyptian collections: how many artifacts currently on display carry similar dangers, curses not yet activated, because the right person hasn't looked at them in the right way? In 2009, construction workers building a resort complex near Aswan uncovered something that temporarily halted the project: a mass burial site containing the remains of 217 individuals, predominantly female, aged between 14 and 25. The bodies weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in concentric circles around a central stone platform, all positioned facing the ancient course of the Nile. Forensic examination revealed water in the lungs, drowning as cause of death. But the bodies had been buried on dry land. They drowned elsewhere, then were transported to this location for interment. The project supervisor reported the discovery to local authorities. 3 days later, officials declared the site a standard cemetery from the Ptolemaic period and cleared the construction to resume. The forensic reports that revealed drowning as universal cause of death never appeared in published archaeological literature. The bones were reburied without further study, the site paved over for hotel foundations. This pattern repeats along the Nile's length. Sites, marked in archaeological surveys as minor cemeteries or flood victim burials, contain remains that tell a different story when examined closely. Bodies showing evidence of being bound before death, wrists bearing ligature marks from ropes that dissolved millennia ago. Skeletal trauma consistent with being weighted down, stones placed on chests or tied to ankles. These weren't flood victims caught by surprise. These were people deliberately drowned in ritual contexts. Hieroglyphic texts reference the brides of Hapi, describing them as essential to the annual flood cycle. Official translations present this as poetic metaphor, symbolic marriages between priestesses and the river god. But the practical details recorded in temple accounting, papyri, suggest nothing symbolic. Records specify selection criteria: unmarried women of specific ages, physical requirements that read like livestock descriptions. They document preparations, including 7 days of purification, special diets, and drugging with compounds that produced calm acceptance. These weren't volunteers participating in theatrical ceremonies. These were offerings chosen, prepared, and delivered to the river. Underwater archaeology in Nile tributaries has located structures that support this interpretation. Stone platforms positioned in deep channels, surfaces worn smooth by water flow, but still showing carved grooves that lead to central depressions. Iron rings, corroded but intact, set into stone at intervals, suggesting they once held restraints. These altars rest 15 meters below current water levels, positioned where ancient channels ran deeper and faster. The placement was deliberate, ensuring whatever was bound to those rings would drown quickly as floodwaters rose. Modern reports complicate the historical picture. Egyptian police files from rural districts along the Nile contain recurring patterns that officials dismiss as coincidence. Annual disappearances of young women during the weeks before peak flood season, clusters too consistent across decades to attribute to random crime. Villages where elders speak of maintaining the old agreements, ensuring the river remembers its obligations. These reports are rarely investigated thoroughly, filed away as missing persons cases in regions where young women sometimes leave for cities without informing families. The Aswan Dam created Lake Nasser in the 1960s, flooding hundreds of kilometers of Nile Valley. Sonar surveys conducted during dam construction detected massive structures underwater, complexes too large and regular to be natural formations. Plans were made for underwater archaeological surveys. Those plans were quietly shelved after initial dive teams reported extensive ritual architecture, chambers and channels, arranged in patterns that suggested sophisticated ceremonial use. Egyptian authorities restricted all diving in those sections. The structures remain unexplored, their full extent unknown, resting beneath water that drowned them just as the river once claimed other offerings. The Nile gave life to Egypt, but that life came with obligations that stretched back before the pyramids rose. Every flood season renewed the covenant, and every renewal demanded payment. The river's appetite was specific, particular about what it would accept in exchange for its annual blessing. Modern Egypt has dammed the Nile, controlled its floods through engineering rather than appeasement. One wonders, if the agreements are truly ended, or simply unfulfilled. The subsidiary chambers in royal tombs follow predictable patterns. Smaller rooms branching from the main burial, containing lesser sarcophagi arranged in hierarchy of importance. Textbooks describe these as honored companions, relatives who died near the same time and were buried together as families preferred. The bones tell a different truth. When archaeologists first examined the subsidiary burials in Jedefre's tomb complex using modern forensic techniques, they noticed something disturbing about the skeletal remains of the 14 children interred in the northern chamber. Each skull showed identical trauma, precise breaks to the second cervical vertebra, the injury produced by expert execution. The children ranged from age 4 to 12. All died within hours of each other, their deaths timed to coincide with the pharaoh's burial ceremony. The chamber had been sealed from outside with no exit passage. These children didn't die naturally and request burial with their king. They were killed to accompany him. Hair analysis reveals chemical compounds in concentrations that shouldn't occur naturally. Samples from child mummies across multiple royal tombs contain alkaloids derived from specific plants, compounds that paralyze voluntary muscle while leaving the victim fully conscious. The ancient Egyptians cultivated these plants in temple gardens, documenting their properties in medical papyri. A child given these drugs would remain aware, but unable to move, unable to cry out, as wrappings were applied and the tomb was sealed. Some mummy positions suggest exactly this scenario. Small bodies rigid in postures that speak of final panic, fingers that never relaxed into death's natural repose. Wall paintings in royal tombs typically show pleasant scenes of the afterlife, the deceased surrounded by family and servants in eternal paradise. Under ultraviolet light, some of these paintings reveal underlying sketches, preliminary drawings that were covered with more acceptable final versions. The tomb of Hetephres II contains particularly disturbing examples. The finished murals show children playing, servants attending banquets, scenes of domestic harmony. The sketches beneath show the same figures in different contexts. Bound positioned on altars, attended by priests holding implements whose purpose becomes clear when compared to tools recovered from ritual sites. Ground-penetrating radar has transformed our understanding of tomb architecture, revealing chambers that were deliberately hidden, even from ancient tomb robbers. In 2015, a radar survey of Hetephres II's tomb complex detected an anomaly beneath what appeared to be solid bedrock. When carefully excavated, the hidden chamber contained 43 small sarcophagi arranged in a spiral pattern. The mummies inside ranged in age from toddlers to early adolescents. Forensic examination showed they all died on the same day, killed by methods varying from strangulation to blunt force trauma to what appears to be exsanguination, blood loss from systematic cutting. The chamber's walls bore hieroglyphs describing these children as eternal watchers and perpetual servants, bound to their mistress not by choice but by ritual murder. The practice wasn't limited to royalty. Wealthy merchants and high-ranking officials maintained smaller versions of the same tradition. A tomb discovered near Saqqara in 2003 belonged to a grain administrator named Tashepses. His burial included 7 subsidiary chambers containing the remains of his household, 2 wives, 5 children, and 11 servants. Chemical analysis of the bone marrow showed elevated levels of opium in all the remains, suggesting they were heavily drugged before death. The youngest was 18 months old, bones showing no signs of illness or natural cause of mortality, simply killed because custom demanded that Tashepses enter the afterlife with his household intact. These weren't anomalies or exceptions to typical burial practices. Statistical analysis of subsidiary burials from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom shows consistent patterns across dynasties and regions. Wherever powerful individuals were buried with attendant chambers, those chambers contain remains showing evidence of simultaneous, non-natural death. The practice was systematic, widespread, and continued for over 2,000 years. Egyptian civilization built eternity on foundation of murdered children and executed servants. Lives ended to maintain social hierarchies beyond death. The question archaeologists avoid asking in published research: why did the ancient Egyptians believe this was necessary? What did they think these deaths accomplished? The tomb inscriptions provide answers that conventional Egyptology prefers to read as metaphor rather than instruction. The dead needed servants in the afterlife. Yes, but more specifically, they needed offerings. Fresh souls, newly severed from life, released in ritually correct contexts. The children and servants weren't just company for the journey, they were currency, payment rendered to entities that controlled passage through the realms beyond death. The painted walls of Egyptian tombs show gods with familiar forms, Anubis with his jackal head, Horus with falcon features, Thoth as an ibis. These are the deities that appear in museum displays and documentaries, the pantheon that official Egyptology recognizes. But analysis of negative space in these same paintings reveals something that was deliberately excluded from the canonical record. Digital enhancement of tomb paintings from the Valley of the Kings shows faint traces in areas that appear empty to the naked eye. These aren't degraded pigments or shadows, they're figures that were painted and then carefully covered with layers of plaster, based wash, obscured but not completely eliminated. When infrared photography penetrates these covering layers, shapes emerge that don't match any documented Egyptian iconography. Entities with too many limbs, arranged in configurations that violate bilateral symmetry. Faces that suggest neither human nor animal anatomy, but something that exists in the uncomfortable space between. These erasures were intentional and systematic. Whoever covered these figures used specific techniques to ensure they wouldn't be visible to normal observation, while leaving enough trace that certain viewers, those who knew what to look for, could still perceive them. The ancient Egyptians maintained a dual iconography, one for public consumption and another for initiated eyes. Behind false walls in temple complexes, archaeologists have found chambers that don't appear in any ancient floor plans. These rooms are small, barely large enough for a single person to stand, with walls of polished basalt that reflect no light. At the center of each chamber sits a shallow basin carved into the floor. Chemical analysis of residue in these basins reveals human hemoglobin mixed with compounds derived from plants known for powerful psychoactive properties, datura, blue lotus, and substances that defy identification using standard reference databases. The concentrations suggest these weren't symbolic libations, but substantial quantities poured regularly over extended periods. Temple accounting records, when examined carefully, contain unexplained numerical sequences that repeat at predictable intervals. These numbers don't correlate with grain stores or labor assignments or any conventional administrative need. But when mapped against lunar and stellar cycles, they reveal a calendar of offerings, monthly deposits during specific moon phases, seasonal ceremonies aligned with invisible stellar conjunctions, annual events the records call the Great Sustaining, that occurred during the 5 epagomenal days between Egyptian years, days considered outside normal time, dangerous transitions when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The inscriptions hidden beneath conventional hieroglyphs speak of those who hunger in darkness, beings described not as gods in the traditional sense, but as something that existed parallel to divine order. These entities demanded regular feeding, not from devotion, but from contract. The texts use commercial language, payment schedules, delivery requirements, penalties for non-compliance. Whatever these shadow gods were, the relationship was transactional rather than spiritual. Sites exist where this feeding apparently ceased. Temples abandoned during periods of political instability or religious reform, left empty as new rulers established different pantheons or redirected resources to alternative cults. These abandoned sites carry warnings carved by later visitors, inscriptions placed at entrances by people who ventured inside and barely escaped. The warnings describe sounds heard in empty chambers, movements glimpsed in darkness, a sensation of hunger so profound it felt like physical presence. Do not enter where the unfed ones wait, one inscription at Abydos specifies. They remember the taste of what they were promised. The mainstream gods of Egypt, Re Osiris Isis, received prayers and symbolic offerings, incense and grain, but in spaces between the public temples, in chambers hidden behind false walls and covered by layers of plaster, other entities received different sustenance. They thrived in darkness, fed on blood and screams, and granted power to those willing to maintain the terrible regularity of their appetites. The question becomes, what happened to those who not only fed these shadow gods, but sought to become like them? The normal human spine contains 24 vertebrae. The mummy recovered from tomb KV-63 in the Valley of the Kings has 32. This isn't a deformity or genetic anomaly. The additional vertebrae show the same bone density as the original structure, integrated seamlessly into the skeletal system, with no sign of pathological growth. CT scans reveal something more disturbing. The extra vertebrae appear to have formed while the subject was alive, extending the spinal column through a process that should have been agonizing and fatal. Yet the bone fusion patterns indicate this person survived years after the transformation began. This case is T-unique. Multiple mummies from elite burials show anatomical impossibilities that modern medicine struggles to explain. Organs positioned in configurations that don't T-match human development, bone structures that suggest surgical modification of living tissue, procedures that required opening the body cavity, rearranging internal architecture, and somehow keeping the patient alive through trauma that should have killed them instantly. The tools recovered from certain priestly burials include implements designed for these transformations, bronze blades with curves that match the spacing between ribs, hooks shaped to reach deep into body cavities without severing major vessels. Hidden chambers accessed through concealed passages in several tombs contain what researchers initially catalogued as damaged mummies, bodies where preservation failed. Closer examination revealed these weren't T failures. The desiccated remains showed continued growth after mummification. Hair extending 12 feet from one skull, still attached to scalp tissue that should have been dead for 3,000 years. Fingernails that had grown in spirals, years of growth curling back on themselves. These bodies weren't simply preserved. They were caught in some state between death and life, flesh that refused to fully surrender despite all moisture being extracted. Hieroglyphic texts reference the lasting ones with a mixture of reverence and fear. These were priests who sought immortality through methods that official religious doctrine didn't sanction. The inscriptions describe the 7 gates of transformation, ritual stages that promised eternal existence, but demanded surrender of specific human qualities at each threshold. The first gate required abandonment of compassion, achieved through ceremonies involving prolonged exposure to suffering without intervention. The fourth gate demanded memory, erasure of personal identity through techniques the texts describe, but modern researchers refuse to attempt reconstructing. The seventh gate required surrender of fixed physical form itself, transformation into something that could persist across ages, but could never again claim to be human. The canopic jars complicate our understanding of ancient Egyptian burial practices. These vessels supposedly held organs removed during mummification, preserved as inert tissue. But jars recovered from tombs of suspected lasting ones contain organs that show anomalies. Heart tissue, with cellular structures that suggest electrical activity, persisted long after preservation. Brain matter arranged in patterns that neuroscientists describe as impossible. Neural pathways that shouldn't form in deceased tissue. Organization that suggests continued function at some level. These organs weren't simply preserved. They remained active, maintaining some vestige of the consciousness they once served. Modern accounts from tomb raiders provide the most unsettling evidence. These accounts don't appear in academic journals, but circulate in underground antiquities markets. Stories told by men who enter tombs illegally and occasionally encounter guardians that match ancient descriptions. Figures standing in chambers that should be empty, forms that seem human in darkness, but wrong when illumination reveals details. Proportions that don't quite match human anatomy. Movement that suggests joints bending in directions bone structure shouldn't allow. Eyes that reflect light like animal eyes, tapetum lucidum in creatures that were once human. These raiders describe consistent experiences across different sites. The guardians don't attack, they simply watch, turning to follow movement with heads that rotate further than human necks permit. Some raiders report voices, words in languages they don't recognize but somehow understand. Messages warning them to leave or offering them the same transformation their speakers underwent. Most flee. A few accept the offer and are never seen again, though occasionally new guardians appear in tombs that were previously empty. The ancient Egyptians achieved what they sought, immortality for those willing to pay its price. But the result wasn't the eternal paradise promised in public texts. It was continuation without humanity, existence stripped of everything that makes consciousness bearable. The lasting ones endure in darkness, watching over tombs through millennia, no longer capable of death, but equally incapable of anything that resembles life. They achieved immortality and discovered it was a punishment worse than any hell their mythology described. The question becomes, if individual transformation created such horrors, what happened when these practices were applied to entire populations? The annual festival of Opet drew massive crowds to Thebes, celebrations that modern Egyptology describes as joyous processions, honouring Ammon's journey between temples. Archaeological excavations beneath the festival route tell a different story. The paving stones along the processional way contain channels carved with engineering precision, grooves that converge at collection points spaced every 50 meters. These channels were designed to handle liquid flow in substantial volume, directing it toward underground cisterns that still show chemical traces of what they once contained. The residue isn't water, it is blood, in concentrations that suggest not spillage, but systematic collection over centuries of festivals. The platforms positioned along the route served purposes beyond stages for performances. Their construction reveals specific design elements: restraint points carved into stone surfaces, drainage apertures positioned at strategic intervals, dimensions that match sacrificial altars found in temple complexes. Official records describe these platforms hosting dances and ritual reenactments. The physical evidence suggests performances of a different nature entirely. Spectacles where the line between theatre and murder dissolved into something that served both purposes simultaneously. Holding structures adjacent to festival grounds present architectural puzzles that conventional interpretation struggles to explain. These enclosures, dismissed in archaeological reports as temporary market stalls or viewing areas, show features inconsistent with commercial or spectator use. Iron rings set into walls at heights, suggesting restraint rather than display. Entrance passages designed for one-way traffic, easy to enter, but requiring external assistance to exit. Floor surfaces showing wear patterns consistent with hundreds of people confined in spaces far too small for comfortable occupation. These weren't market areas, they were pens, facilities for managing populations, awaiting their turn in ceremonies that required willing or unwilling participants. Ancient historians who witnessed Egyptian festivals wrote accounts that later scholars dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Herodotus described a festival at Bubastis, where he claimed 700,000 participants gathered, many arriving in boats that the Nile ran red from shore to shore. Modern academics interpret this as poetic license, assuming he meant red from reflection of sunset or decorative fabrics. But Herodotus was specific about what he witnessed: systematic bloodletting performed on such scale that the river literally changed colour, remaining visibly crimson for 3 days until current and volume dispersed the offerings downstream. The masks and costumes recovered from festival contexts aren't simple decorative items. Chemical analysis reveals many were treated with compounds derived from psychoactive plants, substances that would be absorbed through skin contact during extended wear. Neurological studies suggest these compounds, when combined with rhythmic movement and sensory overload from crowd dynamics, could induce dissociative states where individual identity dissolved into collective experience. Participants didn't simply dress as gods during festivals, they underwent chemical and psychological transformation, becoming vessels for entities they normally feared, capable of acts their conscious minds would resist. Evidence exists for neighborhood blood quotas during certain festivals. Papyri fragments from the Fayum region contain administrative records, listing households and quantities beside each name. The measurements use units consistent with liquid volume, approximately half a litre per household member. The timing of these collections aligns with major festival dates. Citizens contributed blood, either through ritual cutting of their own flesh or by providing substitutes, usually servants or slaves, whose deaths fulfilled the household's obligation while sparing family members the trauma of self-mutilation. The Night of the Black Sun presents the darkest example of festival excess. This ceremony occurred during rare astronomical events, when solar eclipses coincided with specific stellar alignments. Roman observers who witnessed the festival in the 1st century wrote descriptions so disturbing that their accounts were relegated to restricted library collections. They described mass hysteria that transformed rational citizens into a single organism moving with unified purpose. Voluntary mutilation performed with ceremonial blades, participants removing fingers and offering them to priests who collected the severed digits in bronze vessels. Cannibalistic consumption of flesh from sacrificed prisoners, eaten raw while still warm, distributed among crowds who fought for portions like starving animals. The observers noted something more unsettling than the violence, the precision of it all. This wasn't random chaos. Every act followed choreographed sequences, thousands of people moving in synchronized patterns without visible direction, as if responding to instructions only they could perceive. The festival continued for 3 days, participants sustaining frenzied activity without food or sleep, drawing energy from sources the Romans couldn't identify. When the eclipse passed and the alignment shifted, participants collapsed simultaneously, many waking with no memory of their actions, despite bearing fresh wounds and blood-stained mouths. Modern Egypt contains echoes of these ancient festivals, hidden within celebrations that authorities claim are purely cultural. Certain villages along the Nile maintain annual observances during dates that align with ancient festival calendars. Anthropologists who study these modern ceremonies note disturbing elements. Animal sacrifices performed with techniques that match ancient hieroglyphic descriptions. Participants entering trance states during specific ritual sequences. Unexplained disappearances of outsiders who attempt to document the celebrations without proper initiation. The public face of Egyptian religion presented festivals as joyous celebrations of divine favor, community gatherings that reinforced social bonds through shared worship. But beneath the music and processions, darker currents flowed. The festivals were mechanisms of mass ritual, systems for generating and harvesting psychic energy through synchronized violence and ecstatic surrender. They transformed entire populations into participants in ceremonies whose true purposes remain obscured behind centuries of sanitized historical interpretation. If the public festivals concealed such darkness, what horrors occurred in the privacy of individual homes, behind closed doors where no historian could observe? The houses of common Egyptians rarely survive. Mud brick dissolves across millennia, while stone temples endure, which is why we know more about how pharaohs died than how farmers lived. But when excavations do uncover residential areas, they reveal practices that challenge our image of ancient domestic life. Every home contained a niche, usually positioned in the main room's corner, carved at shoulder height into the wall. Conventional archaeology describes these as household shrines for ancestor worship. The interiors tell a different story. Chemical analysis of residue coating these niches shows consistent patterns across dozens of excavated homes from different time periods and regions. Human blood, not in trace amounts, but in concentrations, suggesting regular, substantial deposits. Mixed with the blood are compounds derived from myrrh and cassia, the same preservatives used in temple offerings. These weren't locations where families left bread and beer for departed relatives. These were feeding stations for entities the household maintained relationships with, presences that required nourishment in very specific forms. Beneath threshold stones, the entrance markers to Egyptian homes, excavators consistently find disturbing deposits. Small skeletons, usually infants under 6 months old, buried in postures suggesting they were placed alive. The bones show no signs of illness or injury that would explain natural death. They're simply positioned, sealed beneath stones that every family member would step over daily for generations. Papyri describing household protection rituals reference threshold guardians, spiritual sentinels that would bar malevolent forces from entering. The texts are oblique about what these guardians required to maintain their vigilance, but the archaeological evidence beneath countless doorways suggests the payment was precise and terrible. Common pottery recovered from residential contexts often shows traces that don't match expected domestic use. Wine amphorae containing hemoglobin mixed with fermentation residue. Drinking vessels with interior surfaces stained by compounds that analysis identifies as blood proteins combined with alcohol. Family ritual manuals, the Egyptian equivalent of household spellbooks, contain recipes for strengthening wine and protection beer that include ingredients the texts refer to euphemistically as red essence and life water. The instructions specify sources: menstrual blood for fertility rituals, blood from the household head for protection ceremonies, blood from the eldest child for prosperity magic. The practice of introducing newborns to household spirits appears throughout Egyptian magical texts. Bells describe ceremonies performed within days of birth, rituals where the infant's heel was cut and blood allowed to drip onto the household shrine while incantations were recited. This supposedly placed the child under protection of whatever entity inhabited the home, but medical analysis of mummies shows scarring patterns on heels, consistent with repeated cutting, suggesting the introduction ceremony was only the first of many bloodlettings performed throughout childhood. Disease treatment in common households followed patterns that prioritize appeasement over healing. When family members fell ill, spell collections recommend offerings to diseased demons rather than prayers to healing deities. The texts describe these demons as entities that had entered the body and needed to be negotiated with, bribed to leave through gifts they found acceptable. Blood features prominently in these negotiations, either from the sick person or from substitutes sacrificed in their place. Archaeological excavations of residential areas occasionally uncover caches of clay dolls, crude figures marked with names and hair samples. These substitute children appear in homes where infant mortality was high, replacements for children lost, but apparently still required by entities the household served. The dolls show evidence of having been fed, residue around mouth areas chemically identified as blood. Whether this feeding satisfied household spirits or simply delayed their demands is unclear, but excavations also reveal that homes with substitute dolls often contain more actual child burials than homes without them, suggesting the substitutes bought time rather than providing permanent solutions. The Egyptian home wasn't a refuge from the spiritual demands that saturated temple life. It was simply a smaller temple, a private altar where family served as both priests and offerings, maintaining relationships with forces that promised protection but demanded constant feeding. Every meal might include components meant for non-human consumption. Every family gathering potentially doubled as ceremony. The walls themselves were alive with presences that required acknowledgement, appeasement, and regular sacrifice to maintain the fragile peace that allowed human habitation. If common families practiced such rituals in private desperation, what did professional magicians accomplish with focused intention and specialized knowledge? The tomb of Imhotep, discovered in 1974 near Abydos, contained a body that challenged every principle of human anatomy. The mummy showed normal skeletal structure from pelvis to neck, but above the shoulders, the vertebrae continued in ways that shouldn't exist. The skull, sat 18 centimeters higher than natural bone structure would allow, supported by vertebrae that analysis confirmed grew during the subject's lifetime. More disturbing were the additional joints, 3 extra articulation points in each arm, allowing range of motion no human shoulder and elbow configuration could produce. The tomb inscriptions identified him as a Heka, master, one who walked the hidden paths. These practitioners weren't temple priests conducting official ceremonies. They operated in shadows between recognized religious structures, claiming abilities that orthodox priesthoods viewed with suspicion and fear. Papyri recovered from their burials described techniques for what they called crossing the threshold, methods for moving consciousness beyond the physical body and into spaces they claimed existed parallel to our world. The procedures read like instructions for controlled madness, systematic techniques for fracturing the mind until it could perceive multiple realities simultaneously. Implements buried with Heka masters defy conventional understanding. A metal rod recovered from one tomb registers temperatures that physics says shouldn't be possible. When placed in thermally insulated environments, the rod maintains negative 300 degrees Celsius, colder than absolute zero, violating fundamental laws that govern how temperature and energy relate. Crystalline objects from another burial show internal structures that materials scientists describe as impossible, lattice arrangements that couldn't form under any known conditions, geometries that shouldn't be stable in 3-dimensional space. Most disturbing are the mirrors, bronze surfaces polished to perfect flatness, backed with amalgams containing elements that shouldn't exist in ancient metallurgy. When viewed under controlled conditions, these mirrors don't reflect the room they're in. They show landscapes that don't match any earthly geography, skies with wrong numbers of stars, and occasionally figures moving through scenes that observers recognize as places they've been, but at times they weren't present. One mirror, currently in restricted storage at the Cairo Museum, showed the excavator his own death 3 weeks before it occurred in the exact manner reflected. the papyri describing magical training outline procedures that psychiatry would classify as deliberate psychosis induction. Practitioners underwent sensory deprivation for weeks, combined with hallucinogenic compounds and rhythmic stimulation designed to fragment normal consciousness. The texts promise that those who survive this dissolution of sanity emerge capable of perceiving what they call the layered worlds, realities stacked upon each other like sheets of papyrus, visible only to minds broken free from limiting assumptions about singular existence. Accounts exist of Heka, masters demonstrating bilocation, appearing simultaneously in locations hundreds of kilometers apart. These aren't mere legends. Legal documents from the Ptolemaic period describe court cases where witnesses testified to seeing the same individual in Memphis and Alexandria at identical times, with physical evidence documents signed, transactions completed, confirming both appearances occurred. The magicians themselves explained this as natural result of consciousness that had learned to occupy multiple positions in the layered worlds simultaneously. The chambers where advanced practitioners conducted final rituals still exist beneath the desert, though Egyptian authorities restrict access without explaining why. Those who've entered report instruments going haywire, compasses spinning without pattern, electromagnetic field detectors registering fluctuations that suggest massive energy sources with no identifiable origin. More unsettling are the temporal distortions, minutes passing inside that correspond to hours outside, or the reverse, time flowing at rates that make synchronized observation impossible. Bodies recovered from these chambers show transformations that went far beyond the anatomical anomalies seen in lesser practitioners. Extra organs growing in spaces between standard anatomy, tissue types that don't match any classification in medical literature, cellular structures suggesting hybridization with something fundamentally non-human. These weren't mutations or diseases. The changes were too systematic, too purposeful, alterations that served functions observers can only guess at. The Heka masters claim they walked between worlds, and the evidence suggests they weren't speaking metaphorically. They went somewhere, brought something back, and were changed by the journey in ways that left permanent marks on flesh and bone. Whether they traveled to actual alternate dimensions, or simply shattered their minds so thoroughly they perceived reality through fundamentally altered consciousness, becomes irrelevant when the results produce physical impossibilities that violate known science. If individual magicians could achieve such power through voluntary transformation, what happened when entire dynasties were built on these dark foundations? The king lists carved into temple walls at Abydos and Saqqara present Egypt's rulers in orderly succession, dynasty following dynasty across 3,000 years of civilization. But these lists contain peculiar gaps, decades where the sequence simply skips forward without explanation. Orthodox Egyptology attributes these to periods of political chaos or foreign occupation. The archaeological evidence suggests something more deliberate than omission. These were erasures, systematic attempts to remove certain rulers from the historical record so thoroughly that even their names would die. The cartouches that once held royal names show evidence of intentional defacement. Not the random destruction that tomb robbers inflicted, but careful, methodical chiseling that removed specific hieroglyphs while leaving surrounding text intact. Someone invested considerable effort in eliminating these names, going temple to temple, monument to monument, erasing identities with a thoroughness that suggests fear rather than political revision. You don't spend years removing every trace of a weak ruler. You spend years trying to bury something that terrifies you. The Second Intermediate Period contains the most dramatic gaps, decades where Egypt should have had rulers, but the official record falls silent. Papyri discovered in sealed jars at Elephantine Island, documents that escaped the censorship that sanitized temple archives, reference pharaohs whose names appear nowhere in canonical lists. One fragment describes the reign of someone it calls the Crimson Pharaoh, a ruler who allegedly required daily baths in blood drawn from living subjects. The text claims this practice maintained his youth far beyond natural limits, that he ruled for 63 years while appearing no older than 30, sustained by systematic exsanguination of populations across the delta. Another fragment references the Faceless King, a pharaoh whose physical appearance was so disturbing that court artists who attempted to depict him were immediately executed. The papyrus describes a ruler whose features shifted between audiences, whose face seemed to exist in constant flux, changing in ways that drove observers to madness if they looked too directly. The few surviving artistic attempts show figures with blank ovals where faces should be, empty spaces that artists couldn't or wouldn't fill with features. Recent excavations in the Fayum uncovered administrative records from the 13th dynasty describing population movements that don't match any known military campaign or famine. Entire nomes, administrative districts, were systematically emptied over periods of weeks, populations relocated to central locations and never mentioned in subsequent records. The numbers are staggering. One document lists 47,000 individuals moved from 3 nomes in a single season, with notations indicating they were designated for the Great Sustaining. No records exist of where these populations went or what sustain they contributed to, but the bureaucratic precision of the accounting suggests organized purpose rather than catastrophe. The mummies of erased pharaohs, when they can be identified through archaeological context rather than inscriptions, show evidence of unusual burial practices. These weren't standard royal interments. The bodies were bound with iron chains before mummification, wrapped in shrouds bearing curse formulae rather than protective spells. Their tombs contained no treasures, no furniture, none of the goods meant to sustain the deceased through eternity. Instead, the chambers held only the mummy, sealed in sarcophagi, that were then buried under tons of rubble. These weren't burials meant to honor the dead or provide for their afterlife. These were containment protocols, magical and physical attempts to ensure whatever these pharaohs became couldn't return. Sites where royal names were erased show something more unsettling than blank spaces. The cartouches weren't left empty, they were filled with protective symbols. The Wadjet Eye, the Ankh, the Jed Pillar, arranged in sequences that spell collection papyri identify as binding formulas. Whoever removed these names didn't just want them forgotten, they wanted them imprisoned, trapped within magical constraints that would prevent even the memory of these rulers from manifesting harmful effects. The fear was specific and profound. You don't develop elaborate magical protocols to contain political embarrassments. You don't destroy mummies and bind them in iron to hide administrative failures. The erased pharaohs represented something that transcended normal categories of bad governance. They were dangers that persisted beyond death, threats that required ongoing magical maintenance to keep contained. Egypt didn't just want to forget these rulers. Egypt was terrified of remembering them, afraid that speaking their names or acknowledging their reigns would somehow provide openings for their return. If individual rulers could be so terrible that they required magical erasure, what happened when entire dynasties turned toward darkness? DNA analysis of New Kingdom mummies has revealed genetic patterns that modern medicine struggles to explain. The royal family of the 18th dynasty shows chromosomal irregularities that shouldn't produce viable offspring, yet these individuals lived to adulthood and ruled Egypt for decades. The genetic concentration isn't just inbreeding in the conventional sense. The markers suggest deliberate selection for specific traits, a breeding program pursuing characteristics that natural selection would eliminate. Brother-sister marriages in Egyptian royal families are well documented, presented in textbooks as cultural practice meant to keep power concentrated within bloodlines. But genealogical reconstruction reveals patterns that go far beyond sibling unions. Computer modeling of family trees shows parent-child pairings repeated across generations, uncle-niece combinations that produced offspring who then married back into previous generations. This wasn't just preservation of bloodlines. This was genetic experimentation conducted over centuries, systematically concentrating traits towards some unclear goal. Medical papyri from palace archives describe what they call blessed deformities, physical abnormalities that priests interpreted as signs of divine favor. Extra digits on hands and feet, seen not as genetic mistakes, but as proof the bearer carried blood of gods who existed before human form, was standardized. Scaled skin conditions that modern dermatology would classify as severe ichthyosis, interpreted by ancient physicians as the individual shedding mortal flesh to reveal divine nature beneath. Cranial elongation far beyond normal variation. Skulls shaped in ways that suggest either deliberate modification or growth patterns that defy standard human development. Hidden chambers in the palace complex at Malkata, discovered during structural surveys in 2011, contain disturbing evidence of what these breeding programs produced. The chamber held 73 infant mummies, each showing severe deformities that would have been immediately apparent at birth, but these weren't standard burials. The mummies were arranged in categories, grouped by type of abnormality: skeletal malformations in one section, organ anomalies in another, neural tube defects carefully preserved and catalogued in a third. This was a collection, specimens maintained for study, or perhaps for darker purposes, the chamber's inscriptions only hint at. The infants that survived this selection process, the ones deemed sufficiently divine, grew into adults whose remains pose questions modern anthropology struggles to answer. Tutankhamun's famous clubfoot and cleft palate were mild compared to abnormalities in less famous royal mummies. Bodies showing bone growth patterns that suggest gigantism combined with dwarfism, contradictory conditions that shouldn't coexist. Organ systems that CT scans reveal as fundamentally miswired. Hearts positioned on wrong sides of chest cavities, digestive systems running in reverse of normal configuration. Yet somehow these individuals lived. Dynasty 0 presents the most extreme case. The rulers from Egypt's earliest period, before the conventional dynastic system began, left remains that some researchers hesitate to classify as fully human. Skulls with orbital structures too large for human eyes, suggesting either deliberate modification or accommodation of visual organs fundamentally different from ours. Spinal columns with vertebrae counts that exceed human standard by significant margins. Limb bones showing proportions that fall outside the range of human variation. Too long relative to torso length. Joints articulating at angles that human musculature couldn't effectively control. Orthodox Egyptology explains these anomalies as preservation damage, genetic disorders from inbreeding, or cultural body modification practices. This explanation requires ignoring the systematic nature of the abnormalities, the clear evidence of selection rather than accident, and the uncomfortable fact that many of these severely malformed individuals somehow thrived, ruling kingdoms and producing offspring who continued their lines. The royal families weren't simply inbreeding to maintain political power. They were pursuing transformation, attempting to breed back towards something they believed their ancestors had been, or forward towards something they believed their descendants should become. They saw deformity as divinity, mutation as evidence of successful communion with forces that existed before human form crystallized into its current limitations. The question becomes, were they succeeding? And if so, what exactly were they becoming? Beneath the coronation temple at Memphis lies a chamber that doesn't appear on any architectural survey. Its existence was confirmed through ground, penetrating radar in 2003, then immediately classified by Egyptian authorities. The chamber sits directly below where the throne would have been positioned during coronation ceremonies, connected by a vertical shaft, too narrow for comfortable descent. Those who've seen the survey data describe a space roughly 4 meters square, walls of polished granite, and what appears to be a stone chair facing the shaft's opening. The chair shows grooves worn into armrests, the kind of wear that comes from hands gripping in desperation over extended periods. Similar chambers exist beneath coronation sites across Egypt: Thebes, Abydos, Heliopolis. All share identical architectural features, all positioned directly beneath throne rooms, all accessed through shafts designed to make descent difficult and ascent nearly impossible without assistance from above. The consistency suggests these weren't storage spaces or foundation elements. They were purposeful constructs, stages for rituals that determined who could truly claim the crown. The bodies of princes who died during succession attempts tell stories that medical examiners find difficult to categorize. A mummy recovered from a subsidiary burial near the Valley of the Kings shows tissue damage that forensic pathologists describe as inconsistent with any known weapon or natural cause. The torso bears markings that appear to be claw wounds, but the spacing and depth suggest something with reach far exceeding any animal Egypt ever housed. More disturbing, the tissue around these wounds shows cellular damage matching exposure to intense radiation, breakdown patterns that shouldn't appear in bodies 3,000 years old unless the damage was severe enough to fundamentally alter the preservation process. Another prince's remains show psychological trauma, so extreme it left physical traces. The facial bones are fractured from the inside, pressure that originated within the skull and pushed outward with force sufficient to crack the orbital sockets. Neurological experts who examined the mummy suggest this damage could only result from extreme intracranial pressure. the kind produced by catastrophic seizure activity or exposure to sounds at frequencies and volumes that literally shake brain tissue apart. The tomb inscriptions reference his death as failure before the Watchers, providing no additional detail about what those Watchers were or what failure entailed. Coronation texts contain verses that appear only in the oldest copies, sections systematically edited from later versions. These hidden passages describe the Watchers of the throne as entities that served every pharaoh but belonged to none, beings that required each new ruler to prove worthiness through trials that tested not just courage but capacity to endure what mortal minds weren't designed to process. The texts promise that those who survive emerge changed, carrying abilities that transcend human limitation, but also hungers that mortal appetites never know. Historical records document princes emerging from coronation rituals fundamentally altered. Ramesses I entered the succession chamber healthy and robust, according to contemporary accounts. He emerged 17 hours later barely able to walk, having aged what witnesses described as decades in less than a day. Yet he ruled for only 2 years before death, and his reign was marked by decisions suggesting knowledge of future events, strategic choices that only made sense decades later when their consequences became clear. Interregnum periods, times between stable reigns when Egypt had no legitimate pharaoh, occurred when multiple heirs died attempting succession. The 21st dynasty saw 4 princes die in succession over 8 months, each attempting the coronation ritual and failing. During this period, the priesthood governed Egypt directly, searching desperately for candidates strong enough to survive whatever the trials demanded. The princes' bodies, all recovered from the same ceremonial chamber beneath Thebes, showed varied causes of death: exsanguination, cardiac arrest, what appears to be spontaneous combustion, suggesting the trials weren't standardized but adapted to each candidate's specific weaknesses. The crown of Egypt carried power, but that power came through entities that claimed every ruler's soul as payment. Succession wasn't inheritance. It was negotiation with forces that had consumed every previous pharaoh, convincing them that you could serve their purposes while surviving their attentions. Some princes passed this test. Many didn't. Their bodies, hidden in unmarked tombs, stand as testament to the real price of divine kingship. The ancient rituals are documented, the chambers mapped, the bodies examined. But modern Egypt restricts access to these findings, maintaining official silence about what succession truly required. The question becomes, what else is being hidden about Egypt's past? And why? In 2017, an international team obtained permits to conduct geophysical surveys in the Valley of the Kings, specifically targeting areas between established tombs where radar suggested unexplored structures. The designation KV-64B appeared in preliminary documentation, referring to a massive cavity detected 40 meters beneath the valley floor. Initial scans suggested a complex extending over 3,000 square meters, far larger than any known royal tomb. Excavation began in January 2018. By March, the project had ceased operations entirely, equipment removed, site backfilled with concrete, and all team members bound by non-disclosure agreements enforced by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. What happened during those 8 weeks remains officially classified. Workers who participated in the early excavation stages, speaking on condition of anonymity, describe experiences that led to mass resignations, equipment failures beyond normal statistical probability, drills breaking after hours of use, generators dying simultaneously, electronic surveying tools displaying impossible readings. More disturbing were the psychological effects. Multiple workers reported identical hallucinations while working in specific sections of the dig, seeing figures in peripheral vision that vanished when viewed directly, hearing voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood. The lead archaeologist's final report to the ministry, obtained through channels that prefer to remain unnamed, describes discoveries that explain the abrupt termination. The team breached a sealed chamber constructed from basalt blocks predating dynastic Egypt by thousands of years based on geological weathering analysis. Inside, they found skeletal remains that preliminary examination couldn't classify as human. The bone structure showed fundamental differences. Skulls with cranial capacities 50% larger than modern humans, elongated limbs with joint configurations suggesting different ranges of motion, Alongside these remains sat objects of worked metal showing manufacturing precision that exceeded ancient Egyptian capabilities, geometric forms with no apparent function but perfect symmetry at microscopic levels. This pattern of abrupt excavation termination repeats across Egypt. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism maintains internal documents designating certain sites as culturally sensitive, a classification that effectively prohibits research indefinitely. The criteria for this designation aren't publicly available, but analysis of affected sites shows commonalities. All contain architectural elements predating established chronologies. All produced initial findings that contradict fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian technological capabilities. All were closed after discoveries that site directors described as requiring further governmental review. Satellite imagery from the past decade reveals concerning patterns. Archaeological sites that generated problematic findings have subsequently been covered by military installations or infrastructure projects that prevent future excavation. The Darshur Plateau, where ground-penetrating radar detected vast underground complexes in 2012, now hosts an expanded military airbase with restricted access zones positioned directly over the anomalies. The Fayum Depression, where sonar surveys of Lake Karun revealed submerged structures showing advanced engineering, became a naval training facility in 2015, with regulations prohibiting civilian diving in areas where the structures were detected. The Osiris shaft beneath the Giza Plateau presents the most extensively documented case of excavation suppression. This structure, partially explored in the 1990s, consists of multiple levels descending far deeper than officially acknowledged. Published reports describe 3 levels, the lowest containing a sarcophagus submerged in groundwater. Unpublished documentation from the excavation team describes at least 6 additional levels, accessible through passages deliberately sealed in antiquity. The 4th level, according to these restricted reports, contained chambers filled with liquid that appeared black in flashlight beams, but analyzed as water with suspended particles of unknown composition. What made this liquid remarkable was its behavior. Workers described it as moving against gravitational pull, flowing upward along chamber walls, forming shapes that persisted longer than fluid dynamics would allow. When samples were collected and removed from the shaft, they reportedly became inert, behaving as ordinary water. But within the chamber, the liquid demonstrated properties suggesting something more than H2O molecules in suspension. Excavation in the Osiris shaft stopped at the 4th level. Official explanations cite groundwater infiltration and structural instability. The reality, according to team members who participated in the final descent, involves discoveries that prompted immediate intervention from governmental authorities unconnected to archaeological oversight. The shaft was sealed with modern concrete, reinforced with steel mesh, a level of closure that suggests containment rather than preservation. Egyptian authorities maintain that research suspensions protect fragile sites from damage, that military installations serve national security, needs unrelated to archaeological concerns, that unexplored chambers beneath known monuments simply aren't priorities given limited resources. These explanations might satisfy casual observers. They don't address why sites generating conventional findings receive continued funding, while those producing anomalous discoveries face immediate termination. They don't explain why military facilities consistently position themselves over specific archaeological anomalies. They don't account for the systematic pattern of suppression that becomes obvious when excavation histories are examined comprehensively. Something beneath Egypt's sand frightens modern authorities as much as it did ancient ones. The difference is that ancient Egypt tried to erase these secrets from history, while modern Egypt simply prevents history from being written. The sites are known. The radar data exists. The preliminary findings are documented in restricted archives. But the excavations stop, the sites are sealed, and the public narrative maintains comfortable fictions about what ancient Egypt was and what it left behind. If discovered artifacts that never reach museums vanish into restricted government facilities, where do they go and what do they reveal? In 2019, a database administrator at the British Museum leaked portions of the internal inventory system before disappearing under circumstances that remain unexplained. The files revealed what curators have long known, but never publicly acknowledged. The displayed collection represents a fraction of what museums actually possess. For every artifact in public galleries, approximately 12 sit in restricted storage, classified under access codes that prevent even most museum staff from viewing them. The leaked database contained entries that defy conventional archaeological categories. Item BM, EGI, -1000-973, -0847, listed as humanoid remains, anomalous skeletal structure, metal implants of unknown origin. Item BM EJEG, -1000-998, -2341, described as consciousness transfer apparatus, functional but unstable, requires electromagnetic isolation. These aren't poetic descriptions or speculative interpretations. These are technical classifications used by researchers who examined the objects and found their properties incompatible with established understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. Museums maintain what they euphemistically call special collections departments, facilities that don't appear on public tours or institutional maps. These departments operate under security protocols, typically reserved for military installations. Researchers granted access must sign agreements that include criminal penalties for disclosure, binding them to silence about everything they observe. Former employees who broken these agreements describe warehouse spaces filled with artifacts too anomalous for display. Stone tablets covered in hieroglyphs describing genetic manipulation techniques. Ritual implements that still function despite being thousands of years old, generating effects that instruments can measure but scientists can explain. Some artifacts circulate between museums through networks that bypass normal acquisition channels. Major institutions trade pieces from their secret collections, sharing access to items whose properties require expertise from multiple disciplines. A mummy exhibiting tissue preservation that violates known chemistry might move from the British Museum to the Smithsonian's restricted facility, then to similar departments in Berlin or Cairo. These exchanges never appear in public records. The artifacts officially don't exist, though researchers study them intensively, publishing findings in classified journals that circulate only among credentialed specialists. Storage methods reveal how seriously institutions take certain artifacts' properties. Electromagnetically shielded containers, the kind used for containing radioactive materials or highly sensitive electronics, house objects that shouldn't require such precautions, stone statues stored in Faraday cages, papyri kept in lead-lined boxes, small figurines isolated in rooms with copper mesh covering every surface. The protocols suggest ongoing effects, that these ancient objects continue exhibiting properties that contemporary science struggles to contain. Staff psychological disturbances linked to artifact exposure have led to formal rotation policies. No curator spends more than 6 months working with items from certain collections before being transferred to different departments. The museums frame this as career development, but internal medical records paint a different picture. Researchers who exceed exposure limits develop consistent symptoms, persistent nightmares featuring identical imagery, obsessive behaviors centered on decoding inscriptions they shouldn't be able to read, and in extreme cases, claims of receiving information from sources they can identify or explain. Some pieces have been removed from collections entirely, not stolen or deaccessioned, but eliminated. Items too dangerous to keep, whose effects on nearby personnel could be controlled through conventional containment. The museums don't discuss what happens to these artifacts. Researchers who worked with them before removal describe objects that seem to grow more active with study, as if attention itself fed whatever properties they possessed. Competition between institutions to acquire specific artifact types reveals systematic patterns. Museums actively seek items relating to dimensional travel, consciousness manipulation, and what internal documents refer to as transference technologies. These aren't academic interests in ancient religious beliefs. These are coordinated efforts to obtain and study objects that apparently accomplish things modern science insists are impossible. The public sees golden masks and painted coffins. Behind locked doors, museums Warehouse, the artifacts that don't fit comfortable narratives about ancient civilizations limited by primitive technology and superstitious beliefs. Dr. Hermann Bauer published his findings in 2008 after 15 years excavating in the Western Desert. His paper documented mathematical constants encoded in predynastic pottery arrangements, precision that suggested knowledge of pi and the golden ratio millennia before their supposed discovery. The paper appeared in a respected archaeological journal and generated immediate controversy. Within 6 months, Bauer lost his university position, his funding disappeared, and subsequent publications refused his submissions. He now works in private sector consulting, his expertise in Egyptian archaeology no longer welcome in academic circles. His crime wasn't falsifying data. Peer reviewers confirmed his measurements were accurate. His crime was noticing patterns that challenged established chronologies. This pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. Researchers who publish findings suggesting advanced ancient knowledge face systematic career destruction, not through formal censure or public debate, but through quiet elimination from funding networks and publication opportunities. Grant applications from these academics are rejected regardless of merit, their proposals deemed not aligned with current research priorities. Invitations to conferences cease. Graduate students avoid working with them, understanding that association limits future prospects. Funding patterns reveal institutional bias against certain research directions. Expeditions targeting sites, known to produce anomalous findings, receive consistent rejection from major funding bodies. Applications to excavate beneath the Sphinx, explore deep chambers under Saqqara, or conduct advanced analysis of predynastic sites are declined with formulaic explanations about resource allocation. Meanwhile, conventional projects examining well-understood periods receive generous support. The message is clear: some questions shouldn't be asked. Publication records show how groundbreaking discoveries vanish from academic discourse. Papers documenting unexplained artifacts appear briefly in obscure regional journals before disappearing from databases. Authors report pressure to retract, threats of defamation lawsuits, and coordinated campaigns questioning their methodology. In several cases, entire journal issues containing controversial Egyptian research have been pulled from circulation, existing copies recalled, and digital archives scrubbed. Senior Egyptologists speak privately of the Cairo Convention, though officially no such agreement exists. According to those willing to discuss it, leading institutions reached informal consensus in the late 20th century about maintaining narrative consistency. Egyptian civilization developed along predictable lines, achieved monumental architecture through known technology, and believed in supernatural forces metaphorically rather than literally. Research contradicting these fundamentals faces organized resistance, regardless of supporting evidence. The convention isn't documented or acknowledged, but its effects shape the entire field. Researchers pursuing forbidden topics have experienced fates more concerning than mere career obstacles. Dr. Susan Greenberg, who documented electromagnetic anomalies in specific tomb chambers, died in a car accident 3 weeks before presenting findings at an international conference. Her research data was never recovered from the crash site. Dr. Muhammad Rashad, investigating suppressed papyri referencing dimensional travel, disappeared during a routine site visit in 2015. Egyptian authorities concluded he wandered into the desert and succumbed to exposure, though his experience and preparation made such an accident unlikely. When researchers persist despite warnings, they face coordinated disinformation campaigns. Anonymous articles appear questioning their credentials, their methodology, even their sanity. Social media accounts create manufactured controversies, fabricating quotes and attributing fake research to discredit legitimate work. The campaigns are sophisticated, suggesting resources beyond what academic rivals could muster, implying institutional backing for the suppression. Egyptology has become a field where survival requires selective blindness. Young researchers learn quickly which questions advance careers and which end them. The result is a discipline that polices itself, maintaining comfortable narratives, while evidence of something far stranger accumulates in restricted archives and unpublished fieldwork. The secrets Egypt buried remain buried, not by ancient sand but by modern academic consensus that fears what honesty might reveal. The Serapeum of Saqqara contains 24 granite boxes, each weighing approximately 70 tons, carved from single blocks of Aswan granite. Conventional Egyptology describes these as sarcophagi for sacred bulls, containers for the API's cult's mummified animals. This explanation ignores what precision measurement reveals about their construction. The interior surfaces of these boxes show flatness tolerances of 2 microns, that is 0.002 of a millimeter. Modern machine shops achieve such precision using computer-controlled equipment. The ancient Egyptians supposedly accomplished this with copper chisels and sand abrasives. Engineers who've examined these boxes describe impossibilities. The corners meet at perfect right angles, with no deviation measurable by laser surveying equipment. The lid and base surfaces mate so precisely that inserting paper between them is difficult, yet these components weigh tons and supposedly were positioned using only rope and human labor. Tool marks visible on the surfaces don't match any known ancient technique. They suggest high-speed rotary cutting, methods that require powered machinery that shouldn't have existed 4,000 years ago. But the boxes themselves are less disturbing than what was found in sealed chambers adjacent to the Serapeum. During unauthorized explorations in the 1990s, researchers documented rooms not included in official surveys. These chambers contained objects that defied immediate classification. Crystalline structures approximately 1 meter tall, formed from materials that analysis identified as quartz, but arranged in geometric patterns that don't occur naturally. When brought near electromagnetic field detectors, these structures registered emissions at specific frequencies, power output measurable, despite no apparent energy source. The crystals were confiscated by Egyptian authorities and removed to undisclosed storage. Other chambers yielded metallic spheres showing no oxidation despite obvious age. These objects, roughly the size of human skulls, demonstrated unsettling properties when subjected to testing. Under certain acoustic frequencies, they would levitate, rising to specific heights and maintaining position without support. The effect wasn't magnetic. The spheres showed no ferromagnetic properties. Researchers who witnessed this before the objects were seized described it as violation of physics as currently understood. Objects responding to sound in ways that suggested technology rather than natural phenomena. The Great Pyramid's internal structure contains features that architectural analysis suggests served technological rather than burial purposes. Computer modeling of the shafts, chambers, and passages reveals a system functioning as enormous capacitor. The limestone blocks provide insulation, granite chambers conduct electrical potential, and specific passages lined with quartz create piezoelectric effects when subjected to pressure. The king's chamber sits at the geometric center of a structure that appears designed to accumulate and focus electromagnetic energy. Recent ground-penetrating radar has detected chambers beneath the pyramid containing what appear to be channels filled with mercury. Mercury's unique properties, liquid metal with high density and electrical conductivity, make it useful for advanced technologies. The ancient Egyptians shouldn't have possessed mercury in the quantities these chambers suggest, nor should they have understood its technical applications. Yet the channels exist, positioned in configurations that electrical engineers describe as resembling power distribution systems. Hieroglyphic texts from temple archives reference technologies as gifts from the Star Walkers, beings who provided knowledge in exchange for what the inscriptions call essence of life. The descriptions are specific: devices that could cut stone like soft clay, machines that made heavy objects light, tools that could reshape living flesh. The texts insist these weren't symbolic metaphors but actual equipment, and they specify the payment required: human life force, harvested through rituals. The Star Walkers taught their chosen priests. Some of these devices appear designed for biological manipulation. Instruments recovered from restricted tomb contexts show forms suggesting surgical purpose, but with features that modern medicine struggles to explain. Blade edges that maintain sharpness after millennia, composed of alloys that analysis reveals contain elements that shouldn't combine in ancient metallurgy. Hollow needles with internal structures suggesting molecular level precision, capable of injecting substances or extracting tissue samples with accuracy matching contemporary laboratory equipment. Modern attempts to reverse engineer these technologies have produced concerning results. A laboratory in Berlin that obtained fragments of the crystalline structures for study experienced a catastrophic power surge in 2013, destroying equipment and hospitalizing 3 researchers with radiation exposure symptoms, despite no radioactive materials being present. A facility in California attempting to recreate the acoustic levitation effect documented with the metallic spheres shut down after researchers developed identical psychological symptoms, intrusive thoughts in languages they didn't recognize, dreams featuring geometric patterns that induced waking obsession, and physical symptoms suggesting exposure to electromagnetic fields far exceeding safe limits. The ancient Egyptians possessed technologies that challenge everything we understand about historical development. These weren't primitive superstitions or symbolic representations. These were functional devices, machines that still work when conditions align, equipment that suggests either independent development, far beyond what civilization timelines allow, or knowledge transferred from sources the historical record doesn't acknowledge. Either possibility demands we reconsider fundamental assumptions about Egypt's past and what the ancients were capable of creating, or what they were given in exchange for terrible prices. If they possessed machines that manipulated physical reality, what tools did they develop for manipulating consciousness itself? The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid produces a resonance frequency of 110 Hz when sound is introduced. This specific frequency affects human brain activity in documented ways, inducing theta wave states associated with deep meditation, out-of-body experiences, and altered consciousness. Acoustic engineers who've studied the chamber describe it as precisely tuned, designed to generate this effect through architectural dimensions and material properties. The chamber wasn't built to house a body, it was built to transform the living. Similar chambers exist throughout Egyptian temple complexes, spaces dismissed as storage rooms or secondary chapels, but showing acoustic properties, suggesting deliberate design. The Osirian at Abydos contains a subterranean chamber where any sound made produces overtones at frequencies that modern neurological research associates with transcendent states. Temple records describe these spaces as initiation chambers where priests underwent procedures that permanently altered their consciousness, opening perception to what texts call the layered realities. The sarcophagi found in these transformation chambers weren't designed for corpses. Internal analysis reveals features inconsistent with burial small channels carved into the stone, positioned where a living body's major arteries would rest. Chemical traces in these channels suggest they once carried fluids, delivery systems for substances meant to sustain occupants during extended enclosure. Other channels positioned near the pelvis indicate waste removal, confirming these containers were meant to house the living, not preserve the dead. Hieroglyphic texts describe transformation procedures lasting 40 days. Subjects were placed in the sarcophagi, sealed inside with specific atmospheric conditions, maintained through hidden systems built into temple architecture. Thermal imaging of temple walls reveals these systems, channels running through limestone blocks, connecting chambers to exterior reservoirs. Analysis of residue in the channels shows compounds including mercury vapor, psychoactive plant extracts, and substances that defy identification using standard chemistry. These vapors would fill sealed chambers, affecting occupants' consciousness and biology through sustained exposure. The operation manuals for these chambers survive in fragmentary form, hidden in temple archives that mainstream Egyptology rarely examines. The texts describe procedures to open the inner eye, techniques involving sensory deprivation, chemical exposure, and acoustic stimulation designed to fundamentally alter perception. Other passages detail dissolving the barriers of flesh, processes that apparently affected physical form as well as consciousness, though the mechanisms described use terminology that resists clear translations. Electromagnetic anomalies persist in certain transformation chambers, affecting modern equipment in ways that suggest residual effects from whatever occurred there. Cameras malfunction, showing images of spaces that don't match physical reality. Audio recorders capture sounds at frequencies outside normal range. Patterns suggesting language, but in no recognizable form. Visitors report temporal perception distortions, minutes inside corresponding to hours outside, or the reverse, time flowing at rates that synchronized watches can't reconcile. Researchers who've spent extended periods in these chambers for documentation purposes have emerged changed in ways that concern their colleagues. Enhanced pattern recognition abilities, claiming to see mathematical relationships in natural phenomena that others can't perceive. Personality shifts that family members describe as fundamental alterations to core identity. Most disturbing are physical changes, researchers appearing years younger or older than chronological age would suggest, aging accelerated or reversed through mechanisms medical examination can't explain. The transformation chambers represent Egyptian technology at its most sophisticated and most horrifying. They weren't meant to kill, but to fundamentally alter what it meant to be human, pushing consciousness and biology beyond natural limits. Those who emerged carried abilities that justified the terrible process, but they also carried something else, the mark of having been unmade and remade according to specifications that human evolution never intended. Cellular analysis of certain elite mummies reveals something that challenges everything we understand about death and preservation. Standard mummification halts decay through desiccation and chemical treatment, leaving inert tissue that remains stable across millennia. But mummies from specific bloodlines show different patterns. Their tissue displays signs of cellular activity that shouldn't exist in preserved remains. Mitochondrial structures suggesting metabolic processes continued long after death. DNA showing repair mechanisms that only function in living cells. One case from the 21st dynasty presents the clearest example. The mummy's tissue, when examined at the molecular level, shows telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age, that appear to have lengthened post-mortem. This biological impossibility suggests the body didn't simply stop decaying. It actively reversed aging processes while supposedly dead, maintaining or even enhancing cellular integrity through mechanisms that violate known biology. The preservation techniques employed on these special mummies go far beyond standard procedures. Their tombs contain configurations researchers call soul batteries, arrangements of subsidiary burials positioned in geometric patterns around the primary sarcophagus. These aren't random attendants buried for company. They're components of a system, sacrificed individuals whose life force was somehow harvested and directed towards sustaining the central mummy indefinitely. The subsidiary bodies show extreme desiccation, far beyond what standard mummification produces, as if something extracted every particle of vitality they once contained. Tomb architecture reveals sophisticated electrical systems that shouldn't function after thousands of years but demonstrably do. Arrangements of copper, gold, and electrum create circuits. Crystals positioned at specific points generate measurable electromagnetic fields. Organic materials, resins, oils, and substances, defying identification, serve as what electrical engineers would call capacitors and conductors. The entire tomb functions as a machine, channeling energy from sources that remain unclear toward the central mummy, potentially sustaining whatever consciousness or essence it contains. Hieroglyphic texts from restricted temple archives describe procedures called the Great Extension, techniques for distributing consciousness across multiple vessels. The instructions detail how a single identity could be fractured and placed into subsidiary mummies, living servants, and even specially prepared artifacts. This distributed consciousness supposedly allowed individuals to persist even if their primary body was destroyed, pieces of their awareness surviving in backup vessels scattered across Egypt. The vampire dynasty concept appears in papyri that mainstream Egyptology dismisses as mythological, but the texts are specific about practical details, requirements for regular blood consumption, schedules for life force replenishment, and consequences for missing necessary infusions. Royal accounting records contain unexplained entries listing young individuals transferred from provinces to palace complexes at regular intervals, with no subsequent documentation of their service or fate. The quantities and timing match what the mythological texts describe as necessary for sustaining extended life. Modern encounters with these immortal beings surface in reports that official archaeology refuses to acknowledge. Tomb raiders operating illegally in the Valley of the Kings describe guardians that match ancient descriptions, figures that appear human until observed closely, revealing proportions slightly wrong, movements that suggest joints articulating unnaturally, and most disturbing, recognition. These entities sometimes speak, addressing intruders by name despite no previous contact. demonstrating knowledge of personal details that suggests consciousness far older than any living human could possess. Some archaeologists, speaking anonymously, admit to encounters that shake their materialist assumptions. A researcher working late in a restricted tomb section describes a figure standing in a chamber that should be empty, wearing the regalia of a long-dead dynasty. The figure didn't attack or threaten. It simply watched with eyes that reflected light like an animal's tapetum, biological features humans don't possess. When the researcher fled and returned with security, the chamber was empty, but thermal imaging showed a heat signature slowly fading from where the figure had stood. The ancient Egyptians achieved what they sought: immortality for those willing to pay its price. The payment wasn't just the suffering of those sacrificed to sustain them, it was the surrendering of humanity itself, transformation into beings that persist through centuries, but can never again claim to be truly alive or truly dead. They exist in spaces between, sustained by technologies and rituals that continue functioning, waiting in darkness for the next source of the life force their extended existence demands. The question becomes, if they achieved individual immortality at such cost, what was their ultimate cosmic purpose? The gods of Egypt appear consistent across dynasties in museum displays: Anubis with his jackal head, Horus as a falcon, Thoth as an ibis. But examination of the oldest depictions reveals a different story, one that subsequent dynasties systematically altered. Pre-dynastic rock carvings in the Western Desert show figures that artists clearly struggled to represent using conventional forms. Bodies with too many limbs arranged in configurations that suggest different dimensionality. Heads with features that don't correspond to any terrestrial animal. Geometry that implies forms existing partially outside three-dimensional space. Later dynasties simplified these images, imposing familiar animal heads onto increasingly human bodies until the gods became comfortably recognizable. This wasn't artistic evolution toward realism. This was deliberate sanitization, making the incomprehensible appear manageable by forcing it into shapes the human mind could process without breaking. The oldest images show what priests actually encountered before comfortable lies became canonical. Sites where first contact allegedly occurred bear physical evidence of events beyond normal reality. The Nabta Playa stone circle in the Nubian desert, dated to the 6th millennium BCE, sits at the center of an area showing radiation signatures that geological surveys struggle to explain. The surrounding sand contains pockets of vitrification, melting at temperatures that natural processes can't produce. Fossil records from strata near the site show genetic anomalies in multiple species, mutations suggesting exposure to forces that alter DNA at fundamental levels. The creation myths preserve memory of arrival, rather than metaphysical philosophy. When enhanced imaging reveals text beneath damaged papyri layers, the stories describe how beings broke through the membrane of sky, tearing openings in reality itself to enter our dimension. The language is specific, not descending from heaven, but forcing passage through barriers, arriving with violence that scarred the landscape and traumatized those who witnessed their emergence. Descriptions of gods' true forms appear in texts that temple authorities later tried to destroy. These accounts don't describe beings with animal heads attached to human bodies. They describe entities whose appearance violated spatial logic, forms that seem to exist in multiple states simultaneously. One fragment describes Set as the one whose edges cannot be counted, a being with boundaries that shifted between observation, possessing more dimensions than reality should allow. Another text describes Apep not as a serpent, but as the hunger that bends space around itself, something that warped reality through mere presence. The gods demanded worship, not for vanity, but as sustenance. Multiple texts reference how divine power required constant reinforcement through sacrifice and ritual. Modern physics might describe this as entities from dimensions, where consciousness functions as energy source, beings that learn to harvest human awareness and suffering as fuel. The Egyptians built an entire civilization as a farming operation, systematically generating the fear, pain, and devotion these entities required to maintain presence in our reality. Some cults discovered this truth and rebelled. Archaeological sites show temples that were violently abandoned mid-ceremony, with evidence of priests attempting to seal chambers and destroy ritual implements. The Temple of Set at Ombos contains inscriptions added long after initial construction. warnings carved by later priests, describing what they'd learned. The text reads, "We called them gods and they laughed. We thought we worshipped and they fed. Break the altars before they break through completely." Mummies, designated as God-touched in tomb inscriptions, show cellular changes that medical analysis can't explain through known pathology. Their tissue displays characteristics, suggesting exposure to intense electromagnetic fields or radiation, but combined with genetic alterations that appear deliberately structured rather than random. These individuals had physical contact with the entities they worshipped, and that contact transformed them at the molecular level, rewriting their biology according to patterns from somewhere else. Some entities never left. Restricted archaeological sites where god worship centered show persistent anomalies that suggest ongoing presence. Electromagnetic fluctuations that follow patterns rather than random variations. Temperature changes in specific areas that instruments measure, but heating or cooling sources can't explain. Most disturbing are the psychological effects reported by researchers who spend extended time in these locations. Dreams featuring geometric forms that induce waking obsession, languages that appear fully formed in consciousness without being learned, and persistent sense of being observed by something with awareness fundamentally alien to human consciousness. The gods of Egypt weren't mythological constructs or anthropomorphized natural forces. They were inmates who broke out of whatever dimensional prison originally contained them, establishing themselves as deities among populations that had no framework for understanding what they actually were. The civilization we admire for its monuments and mysteries was built to feed beings that existed outside our reality, sustained by human suffering channeled through architectural structures and ritual practices designed to keep the dimensional barriers broken. The question becomes why this truth has remained hidden, and what maintains the suppression across millennia and through multiple civilizations that replaced ancient Egypt. The pattern of erasure began long before modern archaeology emerged. When Roman forces conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, they didn't just claim territory, they systematically destroyed specific types of knowledge. Military records describe centurions burning entire temple libraries, not during battle chaos, but through deliberate selection. Soldiers were instructed to preserve astronomical texts and mathematical treatises while incinerating anything relating to what Roman reports called the feeding rituals and communion with the formless ones. This wasn't random cultural suppression. Rome had encountered Egyptian practices before and understood exactly what needed to disappear. The early Christian period accelerated this elimination. When Theodosius issued his edicts closing pagan temples in the 4th century, the destruction followed patterns, suggesting coordination beyond mere religious fervor. Temples housing conventional worship were often converted to churches, their structures preserved and repurposed. But sites associated with specific mystery cults, particularly those descended from the priests who claimed direct contact with the old gods, were demolished with thoroughness that required significant resources. The foundations were excavated, the stones scattered, and the ground salted. Someone invested enormous effort, ensuring these particular locations could never be rebuilt or their original purposes reconstructed. Islamic conquest in the 7th century brought another wave of selective destructions. The Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates preserved much Egyptian knowledge, translating texts on medicine, astronomy, and engineering that would later fuel the Islamic Golden Age. Yet certain categories of documents vanished during this period. Papyri describing consciousness transfer, accounts of dimensional travel, instructions for the transformation rituals. These disappeared from libraries that carefully maintained almost everything else. The pattern suggests informed choice rather than random loss, decisions made by scholars who understood which knowledge served humanity and which served something else. Secret societies emerged from Egyptian mystery schools, carrying fragments of the suppressed knowledge through centuries. The Hermetic traditions, the Rosicrucians, various Masonic orders, all claim descent from Egyptian initiatory systems. These groups maintained practices in modified forms, rituals stripped of their most dangerous elements, but preserving the underlying principles. They kept the knowledge alive while ensuring it remained hidden from populations that might attempt to fully restore the ancient practices. Their secrecy wasn't about hoarding power, it was quarantine, containing information that had proven catastrophic when widely implemented. Victorian-era Egyptology made crucial decisions about what the emerging field would become. When early translators encountered texts describing practices they found morally repugnant, they chose sanitization over accuracy. This wasn't conspiracy in the shadowy sense, but academic consensus reached through documented discussions. Scholars agreed that certain aspects of Egyptian civilization were better left in ancient languages, preserved for specialist study, but never translated for general audiences. They believed, perhaps correctly, that some knowledge corrodes rather than enlightens, that certain ideas spread like infections through cultures that encounter them. The suppression continued through institutional momentum rather than coordinated effort. Each generation of scholars learned from predecessors who'd already decided which questions were legitimate and which were beyond acceptable inquiry. Academic careers developed along paths that avoided dangerous territories. Museums acquired collections with the understanding that some pieces would never be displayed. The system became self-perpetuating, not through conspiracy, but through professional culture that rewarded certain approaches while marginalizing others. What began as protective measures in ancient times calcified into academic orthodoxy. The knowledge wasn't hidden to maintain systems of control, it was hidden because those who understood it best, from Roman generals to Victorian scholars, recognized that some doors once opened resist being closed. The question becomes whether this suppression succeeded in containing what Egypt discovered, or merely delayed its inevitable return. Something changed in the Egyptian desert 3 years ago. Satellite images, the kind intelligence agencies used to monitor military installations, began showing unusual activity at sites archaeologists had declared fully excavated decades earlier. New construction appeared overnight at Karnak, at Abydos, at locations along the Nile that alignments suggest correspond precisely with stellar positions mentioned in texts describing the opening of pathways between worlds. But these weren't tourist facilities or research stations. The structures being built follow architectural principles found only in the deepest temple chambers, the ones never open to the public, designed not to honor the gods but to house them. The materials tell their own story. Limestone blocks cut to specifications, matching nothing in modern construction codes. Metals alloyed in ratios that require furnaces operating at temperatures used only in aerospace manufacturing. And beneath it all, chambers lined with crystalline structures identical to those found in the King's chamber, structures mainstream archaeology dismisses as decorative, but which resonate at frequencies capable of affecting human consciousness when activated. Someone with access to both ancient knowledge and modern resources is preparing infrastructure. The question is for what? The missing persons reports provide one answer. Egyptian authorities don't publish consolidated statistics, but independent researchers tracking disappearances near sacred sites have documented a pattern. Numbers spike during specific lunar phases, the same phases hieroglyphic calendars mark with symbols translating roughly as the masters stir in their sleep. Families report loved ones drawn to temples, speaking of dreams so vivid they felt more real than waking life. Dreams of voices calling them home, of promises made by ancestors they never knew they had. Some return, most don't, and those who do come back changed, speaking in languages they shouldn't know, drawing symbols they've never seen. Documents leaked from Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities in 2019 revealed something officials insist are forgeries. Protocols titled Containment Event Response detail procedures for sealing specific sites. If manifestation phenomena exceed threshold parameters, the documents reference stockpiles maintained at undisclosed locations, lists of items that read like inventory from tomb offering chambers, gold in specific weights, grain varieties cultivated in Egypt but commercially extinct for centuries, and blood, human blood preserved under conditions the documents describe but don't explain. Blood from donors selected through criteria the pages redact but hint at ancestry, lineage, genetic markers tracing back to dynasties' history. Claims ended when Rome conquered Egypt. Political chaos in the region hasn't been accidental. Every period of intensified instability corresponds with decreased international oversight of archaeological sites. When governments collapse, when borders close, when attention focuses on crisis, access to the deepest temples becomes restricted, not by looters or militants, but by groups moving with official sanction, conducting rituals in chambers where hieroglyphs warn that certain rites must never be performed again. Rituals requiring participants who speak the old words correctly, who carry the old blood, who understand that what sleeps beneath the sand never truly died. Around the world, people with no connection to Egypt report identical visions. Skies splitting open above pyramids. Beings of light and shadow walking through doorways that shouldn't exist. Stars rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive. Every vision matches prophecies carved in temples closed to the public. Prophecies describing signs that precede the return of those who ruled before history began recording itself. And then there are the DNA programs, international genetic research initiatives, collecting samples from Egyptian populations, ostensibly to study migration patterns and historical genetics. Except the collection focuses on villages near ancient sacred sites, on families whose genealogies trace back to priest classes. The data isn't being used for academic papers. It is being used to find people, specific people, descendants of bloodlines that served the gods when gods walked openly among men. Bloodlines required not to witness the return, but to facilitate it, to open what was sealed, to speak what was forbidden, to complete rituals their ancestors began 5,000 years ago and never finished. They not waiting for the gods to return. They bringing them back. The pattern emerged slowly, hidden in obituaries and missing persons, reports scattered across a century. Egyptologists who announced discoveries challenging fundamental assumptions about ancient Egypt died in ways the official records called accidents, suicides, natural causes. But when you trace the specific nature of their research against the specific nature of their ends, coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. Those studying consciousness transfer technologies described in the pyramid texts suffered complete mental disintegration, found speaking languages that don't exist, drawing diagrams of architectures that violate geometric possibility. Those investigating dimensional aspects of temple design simply vanished. Their offices left locked from the inside, security footage showing them entering but never leaving. And those examining biological anomalies in royal mummies developed aggressive cancers in patterns oncologists, privately admitted, defied medical explanation. Tumors growing in shapes resembling hieroglyphs when imaged. Dorothy Eady knew something was wrong long before she died. The British woman who claimed memories of life as an ancient Egyptian priestess left journals documenting escalating phenomena in her final years. Objects moving in her peripheral vision, voices calling her name in empty rooms. Dreams so detailed she could smell the incense burning in temples that hadn't existed for 3,000 years. She wrote about feeling watched, not by human eyes but by intelligences vast and patient, waiting for her to remember something crucial, something dangerous. Her last entries abandoned coherent language entirely. Pages filled with hieroglyphs she supposedly never formally studied, arranged in sequences that create optical illusions when stared at too long, patterns that seem to move. Other researchers described similar progressions, initial fascination giving way to obsession, obsession deepening into compulsion. And then the experiences began. Archaeological psychologists who studied these cases identified consistent symptom clusters appearing across cultures, across decades, across individuals with no contact with each other. Vivid dreams of being someone else. Intrusive knowledge of rituals they never learned. Sudden fluency in dead languages. And always, the sensation of something massive turning its attention toward them. Recognition from entities that should not exist. Acknowledgement that felt less like discovery and more like being claimed. Some researchers understood what was happening to them and tried to warn others. Their final publications contain hidden messages, information encoded using principles derived from how hieroglyphs layer multiple meanings into single symbols. Dr. James Weatherby's last paper on Seti's tomb includes footnotes that, when read in sequence determined by Egyptian number symbolism, spell out, stop looking, they are looking back. Professor Elena Markova's thesis on Dynasty Zero includes bibliography citations that aren't real books, but coordinates pointing to temples where researchers subsequently vanished. These weren't cries for help, they were warnings delivered in codes. Only those deep enough into the research would recognize messages saying, turn back while you still can. The archaeological teams present the darkest pattern, entire expeditions that radioed final reports and were never heard from again. Search parties finding camp equipment, arranged in protective configurations, matching spells from the Book of the Dead. Circles of objects meant to ward off malevolent forces. No bodies, no blood. Just arrangements suggesting they knew something was coming and tried to defend themselves using magic they'd spent careers dismissing as superstition. The Egyptian government classified those sites, forbidding access, erasing them from maps. But researchers who've accessed restricted archives describe photographs from those camps, images showing the sand around protective circles disturbed from the inside, as though whatever they tried to keep out was already there with them. Knowledge itself became the weapon. Certain combinations of information create cognitive hazards, facts that alter brain structure when fully comprehended. Neurologists studying researchers exposed to specific Egyptian texts found changes in neural pathways, new connections forming in patterns matching temple floor plans, as though understanding the information physically restructured their minds according to ancient designs. Some researchers theorized the knowledge was designed to do this, that Egyptian priests encoded information not just to preserve it but to transform whoever decoded it, turning scholars into vessels, libraries into incubators for something waiting to think through human brains again. The final communications all share one element. Every researcher who went too far, who understood too much, expressed the same realization in their last coherent statements. They hadn't discovered Egypt's secrets. The secrets had discovered them, and once that recognition occurred, once the knowledge took root deep enough, there was no unknowing it. The information didn't just change how they saw Egypt, it changed what they were, and what they became wasn't entirely human anymore. The transformation had begun centuries ago, in the minds of the first scholars who opened those tombs, read those texts, spoke those names. And it continues in everyone who follows, building towards something the ancient warnings called the opening. The moment when enough minds have been prepared, enough vessels made ready, for what sleeps to wake inside them all at once. You've been watching for hours now, taking in information, connecting patterns, following threads through tunnels that go deeper than you realized when you began. And perhaps you think this remains academic, something you can close when the video ends, knowledge that stays contained on your screen. But psychological studies on exposure to Egyptian esoteric material suggest otherwise. Researchers at institutions they won't let me name have documented measurable changes in perception and behavior among subjects exposed to specific Egyptian symbols and conceptual frameworks, changes that persist, changes that compound. The information doesn't just sit in your memory, it reorganizes how your mind processes reality itself. People who've gone down these same paths report what happens next. The synchronicities begin small, Egyptian imagery appearing in unexpected places, conversations that touch on themes you just learned, patterns in your daily life that mirror structures from ancient texts. You tell yourself it is confirmation bias, the brain finding what it is primed to notice. But then the dreams start, not vague impressions but experiences with the texture of memory, walking through temples you've never visited, participating in rituals you don't consciously understand, speaking words that feel older than language, and you wake knowing things you have no reason to know, details you could verify if you dared to look. Some who've travelled this far encounter individuals, claiming affiliation with groups, preserving ancient Egyptian interests. These aren't conspiracy theorists or occult hobbyists. They're people with resources, with knowledge demonstrating genuine initiation into traditions that never died, who seem to know you've been researching, who offer guidance or warnings, depending on what they think you're ready to handle. You didn't seek them out, but exposure to this information apparently broadcasts something, a signature they recognize, marking you as someone who has crossed certain thresholds of awareness. Online communities dedicated to Egyptian mysteries reveal what happens when knowledge becomes collective. Thousands of people, separated by continents, reporting identical dreams on the same nights. Coordinated compulsions to visit specific sites, arrivals timed to astronomical events, none of them consciously calculated, and strangest of all, the emergence of detailed memories from lives in ancient Egypt, memories that overlap, multiple people recalling the same events from different perspectives, constructing histories that don't exist in any academic record, but which archaeological evidence keeps accidentally validating. These aren't isolated delusions. They're synchronized phenomena, suggesting the information itself connects those who carry it, building networks through human consciousness that mirror temple complexes through physical space. The question you're probably avoiding is whether any of this is real, whether what you've learned genuinely poses risks beyond keeping you awake tonight. Ancient Egyptian counter-magic texts describe protective practices for those exposed to dangerous knowledge, rituals designed to shield minds from predatory attention. Symbols drawn in specific sequences, words spoken in particular orders. These aren't superstitions to dismiss. They're technologies developed through experimentation, refined across centuries, preserved by people who understood that awareness itself can be perilous. Whether you need these protections depends on whether the effects people report are psychological manifestations or genuine supernatural contact. But the ambiguity is precisely the problem. You can't know which it is until you're already experiencing it. And by then, dismissing it as imagination becomes harder when your imagination keeps showing you things you later verify as true. There is a tradition in Egyptian magical practice of sealing knowledge, making it dangerous to possess without proper preparation. The information protects itself, transforms those who approach it unprepared, turns seekers into something other than they were. You began this video as an observer, but observation of certain truths eliminates the distance between knower and known. You carry it now. What you do with it, what it does with you, unfolds from this moment forward. The lineage stretches backward, through everyone who learned what can't be unlearned, and it stretches forward, through you, toward whatever this knowledge has always been building. You came here seeking answers about ancient Egypt. What you found instead were questions that fracture into more questions the deeper you examine them. And now you face the oldest dilemma known to those who pursue forbidden knowledge, whether truth is worth the price it demands. The Egyptians had a concept called Marat, cosmic order, the proper balance between what is known and what must remain hidden. Their text suggests certain truths threaten that balance, that some doors were sealed not to protect the knowledge, but to protect those who might find it. Perhaps they understood something we've forgotten. Perhaps ignorance is survival. You must now choose what you believe about everything you've seen. The first interpretation is psychological. Ancient Egyptian practices tapped into mechanisms of human consciousness we still don't fully understand. Techniques that alter perception, induce trance states, create experiences indistinguishable from contact with supernatural entities. The temples were laboratories, the gods were projections. The magic was neuroscience by another name. This interpretation suggests the dangers are real but internal, that protective practices work because they're cognitive behavioral therapy disguised as ritual. If you accept this view, the response is therapy, grounding practices, and avoiding materials that trigger these altered states. The second interpretation is dimensional. Egyptian priests actually achieved contact with entities existing outside our conventional reality, beings from other dimensions or layers of existence our physics hasn't yet described. The temples were communication devices. The gods were real but not divine. The magic was technology we've mistaken for superstition. This interpretation suggests the dangers are external and ongoing, that these entities remain accessible through proper methods, that some humans continue serving them willingly or unknowingly. If you accept this view, the response is magical protection, maintaining wards, and understanding you live in a reality far stranger than consensus allows. The third interpretation is conspiratorial. Groups possessing genuine Egyptian knowledge have exploited humanity for millennia, maintaining power through technologies and practices. They've kept secret, manipulating civilization toward ends that serve their interests. The temples were training facilities. The gods were titles for human rulers with exceptional abilities. The magic was governance through psychological and biological control. This interpretation suggests the dangers are political and immediate, that these groups operate within current power structures, that Egypt's mysteries are tools of ongoing oppression. If you accept this view, the response is exposure, resistance, and dismantling systems built on hidden knowledge. Or perhaps all three interpretations are simultaneously true, different facets of a reality too complex for single explanations. Perhaps what began as psychological techniques created genuine dimensional contact that was then weaponized for political control. Perhaps the boundaries between consciousness, reality, and power were never as clear as we pretend. Look at the world around you through what you now know. Political leaders performing rituals at monuments designed according to Egyptian principles. economic systems structured around scarcity and control matching pharaonic models. Technologies emerging that allow consciousness manipulation the priests could only dream of. Are these coincidences, parallel evolution of power structures, or evidence that what happened in Egypt never ended, that it metastasized, that the pattern continues wearing modern masks over ancient faces? Each interpretation demands different action, different vigilance, different understanding of what you've become by watching this far. But there is a fourth possibility you should consider. What if this documentary itself is part of the patterns? What if information delivered in specific sequences, with particular imagery, accompanied by frequencies embedded in the audio, serves purposes beyond education? What if you've been marked, initiated, prepared for something without your conscious consent? Those who design such things understand that the best way to hide a ritual is to disguise it as revelation. The truth is, I cannot tell you what is real. I can only show you evidence and ask you to decide. But deciding requires accepting that you've changed. The knowledge sits in your mind now, connecting to every new piece of information you encounter, filtering your perception through frameworks derived from the oldest civilization we can barely remember. You cannot unlearn it. You can only choose what you do with it. So what will you do? Will you dismiss everything as fascinating fiction and return to consensus reality? Will you research deeper, seeking confirmation or refutation? Will you share what you've learned, spreading the infection or sounding the alarm? Or will you recognize that perhaps the real test isn't what you know, but whether you understand that some knowledge was never meant to free you, but to determine who is ready to serve what is coming? The documentary ends. Your journey with what you've learned has just begun.